And happy Aloha Sunday to everybody. I am Jeremy Lee Quinn, and I'm joined by Erin Smith. We are going to talk about the week that was. I don't think a lot of people know, but there were 7 political attacks in the same week that Paul Pelosi was attacked. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk midterms. I just got back from the Big Island in Hawaii where I saw the mother of all drag shows. And so we'll be talking drag shows, drag time, story hour, and all of the hot topics. So this is the first time that I've been on in over a year. So I'm glad that we're getting a chance to chat.
Yeah, and I'm honored that you had me back to the first time in a year. So it's great to be back on here. I remember last time we had a really good discussion. I'm looking forward to having another great chat as well.
Now, the last time that we saw each other was Arizona. We went to Arizona State because we were noticing some anti-fascist activity from the local Antifa groups. Now, one thing that I mentioned to you, I was surprised, was that Phoenix went off the night that Dobbs was, Roe v. Wade decision came in. It seemed that there was a lot of security in Washington, D.C., but LA went off and Phoenix.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Phoenix has an interesting dynamic here, it seems, where you've got a core of this activist leftist cadre that can organize a lot of this stuff, but there's not a really big network of the seriously hardcore leftists here. Like in Portland or San Francisco or Berkeley, you've got enough mass of these leftists that you can actually turn out numbers for a lot of these niche interest topics that you probably can't get here in Phoenix. Like here in Phoenix, like we talked about the abortion thing, it was comparing like the Jared Taylor event versus like the abortion event, which is, there was enough center leftist people out there. There was enough core between that and the university where they actually turned out pretty big numbers. And I've noticed it's tricky here, especially in the summer, to really get consistent numbers with a lot of these leftist groups, precisely because it's so hot. You don't really want to dress in solid black for very long. Some of those people I were following around, they looked very miserable.
Yeah, so. Yeah. Now that's the event where the speaker, people were lining up to see the speaker, and then what we just saw is on the other side of that is a lot of people are in black, and it was what, 100 and...
Yeah, it was like at least 105.
105, I think.
Yeah, it was very, very hot.
That takes commitment.
It does. It does.
Now these are the Patriot types, and they were really close at times, and intermittently you wouldn't see that if you were, in Portland, and of course you're getting the classic chants here: "White silence is violence."
Yeah, one thing too I don't see here a whole lot either is the clashes between like the right and the left at the same intensity. It's usually much less than you would see somewhere else. Precisely because I think so many people are armed here. Like it's one thing to attack people in Portland because there's a lot less likelihood of people being armed. But then, and also you would think, well, why would they attack the police like they did after Dobbs released? And in my opinion, part of that is, they're much more comfortable attacking the police a lot of times because the police have like these various serious rules of engagement that a lot of times just one random person on the street, you may not know who you're dealing with. So you see that a lot more, especially because they have their journalist groups and they have a lot of their observers out there with them.
And we saw in that video just then, we're going to see one of the anarchists gets really heated when somebody tries to tell him what to do. The one with the red handkerchief was especially, ostentatious.
Yeah.
And, there was faculty that's out there. And just for the record, Jared Taylor is an ethno-nationalist who talks about ethno-nationalism. Of the Richard Spencer ilk. American Renaissance was the name of the publication that Jared Taylor did, and was kind of very influential on Richard Spencer. So when it comes to those Charlottesville ethno-nationalist types, this is the person that is connected with that. So, but that said, it wasn't a huge protest. And then if you compare it to Penn State, it'll be interesting to talk about why Penn State went off, but Arizona did. You mentioned it was 105 degrees. That's a factor. You know, you don't know who has a gun when you're in
Yeah.
Arizona, so you don't have those conflicts. And if we take everybody back to the picture here, this is end of September, I believe it was, right, when this took place. And this is and the person there with the trans flag patch,
Yeah.
I believe is dressed in fatigues, but is a leftist. Was on the
Yeah.
microphone a lot. And then the fellow there with the red handkerchief was probably the most aggressive anarchist that I saw.
Yeah, I think excuse me. The person in the camouflage was apparently a trans army veteran. They claimed to be, at least. And they were definitely very vocal. I mean, they weren't a physical person, but they were definitely someone who spoke a lot on the megaphone. Like I said,
It kind of took an organizing
yeah.
role. You can see she's
Yeah.
interacting with the faculty, but listen to what this guy says.
No, we can talk wherever we want. We don't know who you're with. So get the fuck out. I'm gonna stand right here whether you fucking like me or not.
So the defiance, the stridency.
Yeah. One interesting note: the person in the red handkerchief that you mentioned, that's actually another trans person. That's actually a trans Muslim convert.
Really?
I've seen them in a few different protests. They are very aggressive, very aggressive leftist.
Interesting. Now here's where they're coming out of the speech.
On campus! No fascists! On campus! No fascists! On campus! No fascists!
Fuck are you looking at, you precious
No
motherfucker?
fascists! On campus!
Fuck you!
There is no room at ASU for your white supremacists!
There's no room on this fucking planet, you pieces of shit! Fuck you!
Pretty standard stuff, I'd say.
Yeah.
Pretty standard fare.
Everybody who's in there facilitating a white supremacist talking on ASU campus should be ashamed! And the reputational damage you have done to this campus, eat shit! Eat shit, LLB! Fuck you!
On campus! No fascists! On campus!
No fascists on campus! No fascists on campus!
And now, when it comes to comparing that to Penn State, just for the record, the white supremacist label, my understanding, actually holds up for Jared Taylor, because he is somebody who talks in terms of ethno-nationalism, whereas in Penn State you had Alex Stein, who's Jewish, and Gavin McInnes, who is this shock jock comedian that started the Proud Boys, but neither of those two are actual ethno-nationalists or white supremacists, whereas the term may actually apply for Jared Taylor, who does this kind of stratified race stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's definitely more. There's a sounder base for an argument in this case, that for sure, than you would have in Penn State, for example. One of the things that's really interesting when you look back at a lot of historical events is just like how often it's, fascist or Nazi gets thrown at people. It's not, most people have this very narrow interpretation of what it means, and that's really not really the way people use it. I mean, I guess it's a lot of people accuse everyone of being a Marxist if someone's a little bit left of center, but it's
Right,
that
or a
type
commie.
of a commie. I mean, that sort of hyperbole is a really common thing, and it's really interesting because you see that type of behavior and claims
No
really happen.
fascists on campus! No fascists on campus! No fascists!
Yeah, in fact,
Fascists on campus!
MSNBC has really been using the fascist label a lot, and it comes to a point where I have to ask, if I'm talking to the Southern Poverty Law Center about hate and labels and bigotry, the fascist label seems to be an unqualified label, which comes from a place of bigotry. You're essentially just calling people fascist and using it as a slur, much like you're using they're using chud or anything. There's nothing that's really backing up that assertion.
Yeah,
Nazi or fascist.
yeah, one of the things that's really interesting too about like the word Nazi is like it it doesn't actually mean National Socialist. If you look back at the history of the word, it predates the Nazi Party. It actually was it was basically the equivalent of chud. It was a slang word for basically an uneducated backwards farmer. So when they started calling people like Nazis, it's like in a way, granted there are a handful of those people still around, but when they throw that thing around, even back then, it mostly started because they were calling like, "Hey, you're a chud." It was kind of the equivalent historically. I mean, not sitting here to defend the Nazi Party or anything, but it's sort of an interesting same how the word kind of evolved today. It's like they started using it as a word like chud, which is kind of the modern day equivalent in terms of how it's actually being used.
Well, and it's used so liberally, shall we say?
Yeah, yeah,
When I saw this in Eugene, in Penn State. Eugene was, and we'll get to the week that was that I'm calling it, where you have 7 political attacks in 7 days, not counting Paul Pelosi. So I'll kind of break that down. But you see, fascists just used consistently as the slur of choice against anybody who is on a conservative side of an issue. Now, that might be an interesting segue to talk a little bit about you and what you've been doing, because you mentioned, have you been politically active leading up to the midterms?
Yeah, well, I've been involved with a little bit locally. I've kind of pulled back from a lot of the serious activism like I used to be, and I'm doing some consulting with different people. I'm working with local counties and in different states. Like I have one of the people I'm working with. He actually, it's sort of interesting because he got together a group of angry parents, and it's really kind of interesting how COVID kind of laid the groundwork for this, because a lot of the restrictions were just ridiculous, and that kind of created this mass of people who are very upset about the restrictions on children and the public at large and businesses. And one of the people I'm working with is, he basically got together a group of like 600 people, and they ended up packing their local party because they had a very lazy local county committee, and like now they're putting up taking over the county. So I've been working with a lot, and I've got a few other people working with similar projects, but that's my most successful consultation I've been doing so far. And I'm working with some local election stuff here in Arizona as well, but I'm not going out there doing as much of the video and frontline stuff as I used to be, because, I mean, let's be realistic. It's been kind of overall a quiet year. Well, it's no 2020. It's probably not quiet, but it's definitely not 2020.
Right. But all eyes will be on Tuesday, and certainly on the Senate race in Arizona as well. How have you seen that locally kind of shaping up?
It's really interesting. Arizona is kind of a weird state. It's not a blue state, and it's almost not even really a purple state. It's like almost this third way kind of libertarianish state that can kind of code either red or blue depending on the topics at hand. I think there's a lot of momentum behind. Like, I think Carrie Lake is definitely favored, and I feel like Blake Masters has got a lot of momentum going as well. It'll be really interesting to see what happens on election day. So I'm feeling cautiously optimistic overall about the state here. So
yeah,
in terms of speaking as a Republican.
It'll be very interesting. To see what people voted on. I mean, of course, I've been covering civil unrest, mandates, COVID restrictions, protest, and the restriction of free speech when it comes to activist groups, certainly that I've seen suppress others. And that'll come up as a theme as I recount the week of October the 23rd. It starts, a canvasser for Marco Rubio gets beat up in Florida. And this is somebody that it's interesting because all of the articles that start coming out start referencing that this person was at Charlottesville. They're like, there's no statute of limitations. If this person was there, then somehow it's hinted that this attack shouldn't be felt in the way that most would when you have a canvasser that's getting beat up while canvassing. So you can argue about whether it's a quote unquote political attack or not. But I would say if the person's canvassing has a canvassing attire and his canvassing is getting beat up while he's canvassing, that pretty much, can we at least say that it's an attack on a canvasser?
I doubt very seriously, even regardless of this person's background, I doubt very seriously that the people that attacked him knew that. So right. It's one of those things that keep in mind. If we want to start digging through people's past and justifying violence against them because they, maybe were marginal at some point in the past, it's like that doesn't reflect on, it's a pretty common thing when you look at like a lot of legal proceedings, like they don't usually allow people to or they don't allow the jury to discuss things that the people who did the crime didn't know because it doesn't matter. And I think that sort of applies in this point of like,
even past trespass.
Yeah. Even that, like if the person who attacked him didn't know, then we should look at it as like, hey, it doesn't retroactively justify what happened to him because the person who attacked him, like, apparently had no way of knowing that. So,
right. And it was more than one person. The canvasser was attacked while canvassing for Marco Rubio, and it doesn't make that much of a headline, but it is clearly a beating of somebody that is in the process of political canvassing. And then the same day you have Eugene, Oregon appear to go off, and I end up going to Eugene. And what's interesting about Eugene is it's a drag show with a 11-year-old girl who's kind of, the featured star of the show. And she's apparently like had a drag mom and another drag mom, and one of the drag moms is under charges for sexual exploitation. And so the club which was called Old Nick's, it was a goth club. And, so like Chris Rufo found a video of one of the nighttime performance, which was, kind of satanic performance art with people running around with dildos and so on. So you have this major culture clash of it not just being a drag show or a drag time story hour, but it's happening in this, goth bar that have pentagrams and votive candles of Pee Wee Herman. So, it's like, it's this sort of very bizarre setting. And then those groups, in the Pacific Northwest have been at each other for so long that when they meet, when the conservatives organize a protest, they know everybody in the Antifa groups who've been around knows everybody in the conservative groups who are these perennial protesters and counter protesters and militants and counter militants, as it were.
Yeah, I'm friends with Shelley. She's the person who noticed that and started covering it, and it's it's definitely kind of wild. It's one of those things where like maybe you could make an argument for like drag queen story hour, but so like when you start involving children like this in the actual performance, then you start to rapidly become. It starts to enter an area where, I don't really know about that. I mean, I've been to plenty of drag performances. I enjoy the performances, but part of drag in the sense of the part of the drag that comes from more of the gay community, it's very body and has this body aspect to it. It's comedic and it's satirical, but it's also body and very sexualized. And I'm deeply uncomfortable with children doing that. Like I'm especially, then not to give a pass to some of the child pageant stuff, which is creepy as hell. And like even the things that like heterosexual cisgender people do, I'm weirded out by that stuff as well. I think that's important because, drag and cross-dressing has a comedic aspect to it. And you see this in more mainstream society and performances. It's been like a shtick for a long time, but a lot of this stuff, like I'm deeply concerned about it. And it really is kind of, it's kind of crossing the line or going too far.
Are you seeing this video?
I can't actually.
Oh, I wonder if the stream is seeing it. I was trying to share some of the video from Eugene. Let me just check really quick. But what's interesting is that yes, it was it was a protest inside the drag performance was happening, and I did go inside as well, and I'll compare what I saw last night in Honokaa, which is in North Hawaii Island, compared to what I saw in Eugene, and there were two different shows. Now that's if we could see it, that's John. I guess it's not screening, not sharing the screen. Let me see if I can figure this out really quick. But there were two very different shows, and I have lots of thoughts on both of them, to be honest. Like in a kind of way. But I've got to figure out how to just get some of this video. And what I might do here is just, if people bear with me, is just download some of these clips to my computer. But so in Eugene, what was interesting, I'll be able to play some video from Eugene, is that you had this controversy of the 11-year-old who's performing, and a lot of misinformation comes out. The Antifa groups, the pub releases a statement that is done by the friends and family of the actual mother, and there's a lot of misinformation. In other words, that Honey Badger Mom is married to a Proud Boy. That was used to kind of gin up a sentiment, and also that the child had been doxxed, which was not the case. But there was a very serious discussion going on about an 11-year-old participating in a drag event, but also being around someone who was under charges of sexual impropriety and so on. And so there was a lot of discussion around that. There were some conversations that people had where they were talking politely at the beginning, but eventually what happens is the Black Bloc group uses the police tactic, which is move. I forget what they're saying, like move out, or they keep chanting.
The move back,
and they pushed out the right wingers. A couple of conservatives got sprayed, maced in the face. They knocked over a transient. There was a transient in the park who didn't want to move and was kind of resisting them, so they knocked him over. And then there was a volley at the end in which rocks were exchanged, and I don't have video of who threw the first rock, but rocks were thrown back and forth, and the sort of trademark green smoke bomb was there. And Freya Lee was there. Move back was what they were chanting, and it was an interesting kind of dynamic in the sense that for the police were up on an overpass. One officer was in the club that I saw, and then the police were on two separate rooftops, but basically letting the anti-fascists police the area. Both sides had ARs, which made it a kind of tense thing. I thought nothing was going to happen because both sides had ARs, I thought nobody would attack. But sure enough, the Black Bloc leftists attacked, and the guy with the AR was one of the first people walking in the other direction. So
yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, no, it's interesting how that works. It's a lot of this stuff, you see this with a lot of these blue states, because what happens with these Antifa groups and with like the various leftist gun clubs is, they kind of allow them to perform as a paramilitary function, and you don't even have to get permission from the police. I'll let you go ahead and play that.
Let me just lower the volume a little. You see the police cameras there. There was a camera tree that was set up, so they were monitoring everything. But you were saying they kind of just take a hands-off approach.
Yeah.
Now this guy's going to give me the finger. He's going to give me a finger here. But then he kind of nods, because I kind of looked him in the eye and I just kind of gave him a look like, look, I'm not here to, it's almost like sometimes you're like dealing in the wild here,
Yeah.
And someone give you the finger, you just have to kind of look at them and say, I'm not here to, talk bad at you. I'm just here to record what's going on and give everybody a fair shot. So I don't. That guy got into it. It became very obvious that people knew who he was. He had a club with him and was doing a little jawing back and forth with the leftists there. But you could see on the left is where the protesters are lined up, and then the leftists are. There's John Hacker right there, who is a well-known leftist involved in different groups there in the Pacific Northwest. But you could see, yeah, the anti-fascists have come out onto the street. You know, there was encroaching back and forth. Everybody kind of grandstands a little bit. There's a father that got maced in the face because he was coming from that side over to the regularly over to the side of the pub. But it was like this for a good 1 or 2 hours of just grandstanding. There you have the Handmaid's Tale all of a sudden, and press indulging on that. So it was quite the scene. I thought, though, when I went into the club, because I thought I was one of 3 reporters who they let into the club, and I thought I have to kind of do my due diligence and see what it is.
You see that? Have I ever been convicted? Fuck you. 3 of them. Fuck you. Fuck you.
So that the Handmaid's Tale. But so that guy and this guy.
All you do is fucking talk. Come here. No, fuck you.
So
wow.
Between all the fuck yous, we got this guy in a tie-dye who ends up getting kicked out by the leftists later for whatever reason. You got John Hacker there. You got the Handmaid's Tale. Then you got the black guy who's bald there is a Proud Boy. I interviewed him once in Salem, not knowing he was a Proud Boy, but he's very sort of active and he was kind of aggressive. So you got the whole cast of characters out, there in Eugene that really seem to know each other. And again, the police are hands off. Both sides have ARs, and the police are back there on that overpass. You see the freeway in the background.
Oh yeah.
They're back there and up on houses on the other side of the club. Now inside the club, what I saw was pretty tame in the sense that I'll say that the drag queen was the most interesting performer because most of the performers were there were some that were women. And they were lip syncing and just kind of posing, but the drag queen was reading the stories, and I didn't find anything inappropriate. It was like, just stories. And whereas the show that I saw last night in Hawaii was definitely more adult and more, kind of the club thing. This seemed to actually have been a like drag queen story hour, PG thing that was going on in there. The thing that I found weird was the kids with the $1 bills, because lots of kids were being given $1 bills and they were waving them around inside the club, and I found that odd. I used to tip buskers when I was a kid, and I was in, and I grew up in, my parents met at UC Berkeley, and so in San Francisco Bay Area, Beta Breakers, we'd see, Dicks on Parade on what is this? What is the street again that's south of Market where they have the all the guys in the chaps and all that?
That's Folsom Street Fair.
Folsom Street, yeah, the Folsom Street Fair, all that stuff. Like,
I actually lived on Folsom Street, so as you can imagine, I saw a lot of that. So
you did, and you were politically active at that time in San Francisco.
Yeah,
you ran for which office?
State Senate. So.
Right. State Senate.
Yeah. I ran against Scott Wiener, the guy who's always in the news for something involving some, various controversial bills or whatever. So, it's no. Go ahead.
Yeah, because you were in the minority party running in San Francisco, and what was that like putting together a Republican platform when you ran in San Francisco?
It was definitely interesting. Obviously, I was very sure unless something crazy happened, I was not going to win. So a super MAGA platform was not going to really fly there. So I really kind of, the fun thing of being kind of the minority party in that situation is you can kind of really, go in there as a spoiler and try to like really question and push back harder and in different ways than you could somewhere else where it's really if it's a really close race, I can actually they can't actually afford to take the risks that I could. So for me, it was all about like I was talking about, I made a big thing about nuclear power because I was like, look, it's like California, yeah, the power system here is screwed up. Let's get nuclear power going. Let's like, build these hybrid reactors in California because, and fix because the Pacific Power there system is completely unreliable and just like it's always catching on fire and burning up the state. So, but it was really fun though. I ended up getting 11% of the vote, which is a lot in San Francisco for running as a Republican. We had like 6% registration at the time. Anytime you run as a Republican in San Francisco and get double digits, that's an overperformance. So I was pretty flattered for that. But
Now,
it was
did
an interesting, yeah.
identity politics come up a lot, or was
Yeah,
what?
it came up a little bit. People want to know like why is a trans person a Republican? And I'm like, like look, it's you can't just take people for granted, and it's there's things that I'm interested in that the Democrats don't care about at all. Like, yeah, I actually didn't really bring up guns because I'm a huge gun rights person, but I was just really more focused on a lot of the specific things in the area that people were concerned about. So. I did have a little, I actually had, a couple stories where I could tell that they kind of cut, how it is where they try to quote you in certain ways where it doesn't make your point doesn't come across the way you intended. But I actually had a couple of other reporters who really kind of went out of their way to cover things fairly and talk to me about my thoughts and experiences. And it was a good experience, and yeah, I was pretty gratified to go through with it.
Someone's giving you a shout out right here. Just jumped in. Is this
Hey,
trans Republican? Whoa, bravo.
thanks,
So
Joe.
yeah, Joe giving you a little shout out here.
Mm,
From a Republican perspective, but also let's talk more about the drag queen story hour, but also
Yeah,
I think what's interesting is drag queen story hour becomes so controversial, perhaps because if it's paired with, or a lot of people want to talk about trans ideology, or the
yeah.
transitioning of kids, which hasn't been much of a topic in this election cycle, but I can't imagine that it won't be a very big topic in the next election cycle. Do you have any opinions?
Yeah, it's one of those things where I was actually talking with one of my trans friends a couple weeks ago, and she transitioned a long time before I did, like back in the old days of the 90s, and it was or actually like right around 2000 or so, and like her experience of everything was there was this thing, and it's really interesting even from my perspective how much things have changed because there were the opinions that people held, the mainstream trans community opinions from even 10 years ago are now essentially treated as being reactionary. Like there was the whole thing of like there was a point where people back then, even like 2012, 2014, were like, no, you don't self-medicalize, you don't order hormones over the internet, you go talk to a doctor and you talk to a therapist for months, and then you're absolutely sure what you're going to do, and then go to a doctor, and you go through this thing. And it was a very important to follow the process, and it's something now that's dismissed as gatekeeping. And so much of the talk, then the discussions we had around gender identity were like, look, it's a medical situation because when you're, and there was lots of talk and studies of brain matter and everything, and people were like, look, it's just the brain when you develop, and there's this very medicalized basis around gender identity, and all of this stuff now is treated as like reactionary right-wing ideology. Even the stuff like from 2012, 2014, that was what everyone sort of accepted in the trans community was like, it's something that's just dismissed out of hand by a lot of these new activists. And it's really kind of weird and disconcerting. Like there was never any real doubt with most people that like, hey, you literally are not changing your sex, that doesn't change. But now it's like, sex isn't real, but you can just pass out hormones over the internet and like there's no real like it's just, it's hard to kind of keep track of all this stuff. And it's really kind of weird. My friend was like, demedicalizing the trans. She said like demedicalizing the trans situation or transition just has been a tragedy, was in her opinion. And this is someone she transitioned like probably 25 years ago and she's living stealth, and what stealth is like another thing. That's like something people don't do these days. That's where people like transition and they try to just move on with their life. That's another part of it too, is people talk, they even like I said, 2014 or so, transition was a process. It was something you did, then you're done with it and you move on. Then you just live like a normal person and you forget, or you don't even have to forget. It was like, it doesn't matter because it's over with. You're going to live like any other person now. It doesn't matter. But now like transition is an identity where it's like, you transition and that is the defining thing about you. And you're just loud and out and proud about it, which I guess, can be okay. But then that's different from, I'm just going to transition and be like a normal man or woman, but I just had a different origin story, to this thing of like, I am trans and that is my identity. And it's like it's a whiplash thing, I swear, because it's like, my opinions around the trans issue in terms of transitioning are the sort of things that haven't changed, but the trans community sure has.
And when did you see that change start to happen?
It was maybe you could see part of it like in 2014, 2015, like people like leading edge stuff was starting. And it's kind of weird because, and this is part of the thing, is like the whole point of was you transition, then you just move on with your life. And one of the things that's really common you see there is like people will transition and they just stop hanging out. Like there's websites and there's community support groups and stuff. Then once you're kind of done or you reach a point with transition where you're happy with yourself, you just stop going to those sites, you stop going to those groups, because what's the point? And it was like around late 2015, early 2016, I kind of started to leave those groups because I didn't really find a need for it anymore. And it was probably like 2016, I think, late 2016, 2017, probably right around the time, the Trump mania really started going, that you started to see that, it really you started to hear it pick up. And I think it's probably in the last 4 years or so, 3 or 4 years, where it's just completely changed from the community that I was involved with.
And when you see it now coming into, viral videos, discussions, becoming such a huge discussion point in politics, and I see it, what kind of thoughts and feelings do you have in seeing that, especially when sometimes the rhetoric becomes so heated?
Yeah, it's my old roommate. Here's a funny story. My old roommate, she was completely passable, very attractive woman, trans woman. No one could really tell until she said herself. She told her story and mentioned she was trans. Like she used to say all the time, we're not real women, right? And she was just like very upfront about that. And that's sort of the thing now that will like just get you excommunicated. So, and I think this is one of those things that's very unhealthy because it leads to these very unrealistic expectations with people. And a part of this here, if you want to play the clip, I can shut up for a minute. So I'm kind of
Oh, no,
going.
I was just going to ask you a quick question about what
No,
we're
go
about to
ahead.
see, which is, how do you find the as a Republican and being in Republican spaces, the media projects this image that there's low tolerance and high bigotry, and certainly when you talk to Christian conservatives, they have very traditional and strident opinions in regards to not just transitioning, but homosexuality and gay marriage. So how, when you see spaces like this and images and the rhetoric becomes very Christian oriented, and how have you perceived that cultural climate?
Yeah, it's one of those things that really does kind of concern me, because I think it leaves us with much less room to actually live our lives. Because the thing about Republicans and conservatives is, it, even if they don't approve of something, what I've personally noticed is a lot of these people, like, when I grew up in Mississippi, like there was a black trans woman that had like a store in the Mississippi Delta. And it was one of those things of like, maybe it's a Southern thing, especially, but like we're very used to dealing with eccentric people. Like, even though if we're like traditional or conservative, like there's lots of very eccentric people around. So it's one of those things of everyone's polite and we just kind of ignore it. And I kind of think that that's something more right-leaning people have had for a long time. Like, they may not approve of whatever you're doing and they may not cheer you on, but they're much more willing to kind of allow things to slide, if you don't force them to care about it. And it's this kind of just courtesy thing people do. And I've just kind of noticed of like, no, go ahead.
No, I was going to
Mhm.
say, I mean, that seems, I was talking with a conservative. I was on doing a live cast a couple weeks ago as a guest, and I talked about, there's this very porous, um, border when it comes to who comes into the right wing space, in the sense that anybody can really come there. And he said, well, that's kind of the point of freedom, is that people, the point of freedom is not for me to judge you and tell you, what you are and aren't and allowed to be, or where you should be.
Yeah, it's like I had a step uncle who was gay, and it was interesting because he was from the older generation. He's my step uncle, grew up in that area, is very conservative, and it's one of those things of everyone kind of knew, but you don't like make a point of it, where it's not like in everyone like it's, and it wasn't even sort of a thing of like people kind of keep their business to themselves, and that's just one of the things I've noticed. Maybe it's a specific Southern thing, but it's something I've seen across a lot of people who are right wing, um, in across America. If you don't really force them to care about it, they're not going to care about it. But that's one of the things that concerns me, is a lot of these people in the LGBT community now are just becoming so extremely performative that they are kind of forcing people to care about it. Like, I've met lots of Republican people and conservative people that will use preferred pronouns if you don't make it this submission sort of, you know, agenda thing, or if you're not forcing it, you're turning it into like a submission ritual, then they're not going to. But if it's just a courtesy thing, a lot of people will do that, and that's sort of, I haven't, like, look, I transitioned 7 years ago, and I've traveled the world, and the only time anyone's given me, like, I've only had two incidents that where anyone kind of gave me anything like any uncomfortable situation, and one of them was in DC, from a black lady, and the other one was a squad of Ukrainian soldiers in Eastern Europe. I mean, that's the only two times I've ever felt uncomfortable about being trans with anyone in 7 years. But I've been uncomfortable for being a Republican. I've lost count of how many times I've been made to feel uncomfortable for that.
Hmm. And we're going to have to get back to the squad of
Yeah, yeah.
Ukrainian soldiers, because I'm sure there's a story there.
There is definitely a story.
Freya here is asking, is Erin on Twitter? What's your handle, just so people know where to
Yeah,
find you?
yeah. Aaron Smith, at Aaron Smith SF. It's spelled ErinsmithSF.
SF. Okay, so Erin Smith SF is your Twitter handle. And what are you, you know, there's been times where obviously you have a history of being active politically. You were, active leading up to the midterms and stuff. What do you see for yourself? Just asking about you going forward. What would you like to see? What would you like to? How would you like to address some of this? Whether it becomes because it's essentially it's great, it's gay and trans culture, which is being thrust into the limelight due to activism. As a Republican, any thoughts about a role that you might have, or what you would like to see?
Yeah, it's one of those things. It's I've tried to stay out of trans activism because I don't want to be defined by that. I've tried to be someone who I have my topics of interest, and the fact that being trans is one of those things that is maybe interesting, but it's not the thing that I want to deal with. Like I'm kind of growing more, and I've been more and more allergic to like identity politics sort of stuff. But the thing that concerns me with a lot of the direction of the trans community and trans activism is I may not really have a choice much longer. We're seeing a lot more of these detransitioners come out and be active and vocal. So I think we're kind of getting to a point where trans people who don't want bad things to happen or don't want acceptance to crater, we're going to have to openly come out and start criticizing a lot of the things we're seeing today. So I'm kind of gritting my teeth, but I'm probably going to start addressing a lot more of those topics in the future. Yeah, so I'm doing a lot of my consulting stuff. I'm going to focus a lot on that, but I see we've got this lull going on. I kind of feel like things are going to get sportier in the streets again, and I'll probably be out there undercover as well. But I think but to get back to your basic point, I'm probably going to have to dive off into doing a lot more trans activism.
Now I'm going to play a little video of last night. So Eugene, which we just talked about, that was on Monday. Now to quickly go through the week that was, as I'm calling it. So you have Sunday, you have the Rubio canvasser attacked. You have this Eugene conflict. In the end, when all is said and done, you have at least two, I think possibly even three people that were conservatives that were maced, and the transient houseless person who was knocked over by the Black Bloc. You then the next day is Tuesday, and there was supposed to be a rally in Portland. And there's this group that there's been some interesting dialogue, and I would call them a hardline, a trans exclusionary group of feminists who say they are very outspoken against the gender ideology, but they also take it as far as wanting to protect women's spaces and want women's spaces. One person was very vocal, and then I realized several were very vocal about wanting women's spaces for those who have fully transitioned to be excluded. And so you have that voice, which is getting louder and louder. Now that group, regardless of what one agrees or disagrees with, that group met in Portland, and I don't know that group is uniformly all has that opinion, but a group of women, for Free Speech for Women group, that, and I don't remember this woman's name, who is from England, who has been a very vocal person in this cultural conflict. She had threats against her, so she did not show up in Portland. Then on Tuesday, the women who did show up and speak, they got pied in the face. The activists came and pushed them and assaulted them with pies. Then the next day, that group met in Washington, and you had in Tacoma, Washington, you had a big, huge, young activist presence that pushed these women out of the public square, so to speak. There were some volleys. One woman was spit on, and then she quickly responded with pepper spray. So that's Wednesday. Then Thursday at UC Davis, you have Stephen Davis, I believe is his name. He's known as MAGA Hulk or Hulk MAGA. Big, huge black bodybuilder, who was showing up to speak as a guest for Turning Point USA at UC Davis. a protest is organized against him for denying systemic racism, that he's racist for denying systemic racism. He's this big hulking black dude. I was like, there's no way that they're going to protest this. They did. There was some sort of female student got, pepper sprayed. There was some sort of volley between local Proud Boys and anti-fascists. It was a whole thing on UC Davis. And then only then do we get to Friday, which is the attack on Paul Pelosi from somebody who is so culturally just off the spectrum, a Canadian undocumented immigrant who comes from the SF nudist scene and nudist activism, appears to have quite a wild history, and is really on a part of every conspiracy theory under the sun when it comes to 9/11 conspiracies, aliens, and yes, the right-wing ones too. But of course, that's what makes the headline, is that Paul Pelosi is attacked by a right-wing conspiracy theorist. Whereas this is clearly a mentally ill person with a lot of conspiracies that was on a quote unquote suicide mission, as he told authorities in San Francisco.
Yeah, it's the Paul Pelosi thing is so crazy. Like there's something in that story for everyone, like you just said. It's like you've got this guy who, a nudist illegal immigrant, like street activist guy who lives in the hippie commune. That's generally not coded as a right-wing sort of person. And like if you look back
culturally
at it,
MAGA.
Yeah, it's not the essence of MAGA lifestyle for sure. But yeah, it's like that sort of thing. It's like in the Bay Area, and this guy apparently, it turns out, like he had this serious drug problem, and like another thing, this guy who fried his brain with drugs, and he's like this weird hippie nudist illegal alien, like attacking.
He was living in Richmond, in like a garage or something across the bay. And as Bay Area people, we know the geography is significant. You can take BART from Richmond. You can take public transportation from Richmond across the bay into San Francisco, and you can get to Pacific Heights and find Nancy Pelosi's house. And that's in a lot of ways, it was a target of opportunity. It appears.
Yeah, and that's part of the thing with these people, and this is the sort of people you see on the streets everywhere in San Francisco. People that are just fried, and like it's one of the things where it goes back to the policy failures of the Bay Area of like people like this should have like drugs are effectively decriminalized there, and a lot of this stuff these people they weren't allowed to get away with a lot of these things. You wouldn't have crazy people breaking into Paul Pelosi's house. And this is something you see a lot here with this stuff is as rhetoric gets more heated, you've got a lot of really mentally unstable people. And some of these people, they veer very quickly from left to right. We had one of the things that happened this summer with Kavanaugh, the guy who ended up showing up at his house with a gun to assassinate him. And it's sort of interesting to compare and contrast those two, because I had people who've already memory holed the Kavanaugh attempted assassination, because they're like, yeah, well, Paul Pelosi got hit with a hammer, so it doesn't matter if someone was just yelling at Kavanaugh over his dinner. I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. Did you forget about the assassin guy? And they're like, no, he gave himself up. I'm like, well, yeah, he got out of the car at his house, and there was 2 deputy U.S. Marshals standing right there, and like that's part of the thing. It's like if those guys hadn't been there, would he have tried to actually shoot Kavanaugh?
Well, he did travel the distance. He came all the way from Simi Valley, Southern California, to Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and apparently that guy, he was fairly mentally unstable as well. But so much of this stuff is very interesting. Is you see, again, the media is much more aligned, politically with the left. So they do that sort of thing where they want to minimize this. But Pelosi is, you've got that's completely, I mean, there's part of that. I think that led a lot to some of the crazier theories people were coming up with about the Pelosi situation, about the gay hammer fight thing. I doubt that was anything close to the truth, but something that's part of the thing that leads to that is no one really trusts the media anymore.
There
So
was there was also, it was a little bit of opportunism
yeah,
on a press release, a linguistic error, which is they said that Paul Pelosi and the assailant were holding a hammer, and
yeah,
so what they meant to say was they were struggling over one hammer,
one
not that
hammer,
they
yeah.
each had hammers, and then somehow became a underwear hammer fight.
Yeah, I think there was a thing where they said too, it was like he said he was his friend. Like another thing that wasn't really like it was everything was poorly written. No one trusts the media. Then what came out was incredibly poorly written. So it was very easy to read everything that they said, and it's like this is like a consensual sort of nude hammer fight or something between friends was one way to read. If you were someone who are not inclined to read the media statements charitably, that's what it came across as. And it happened in San Francisco, so like people, anything that happens in San Francisco, people are just going to assume it's the weirdest possible interpretation
Like,
of the story.
why wouldn't it be a consensual nude hammer fight?
I mean, it's not the craziest thing that's happened in San Francisco.
Right.
So I mean, it's it's easy to fall in the polarization thing, and like I don't wish ill on Nancy Pelosi or her family, but I understand where people are kind of coming from with that whole situation. Again, like the whole when you see everything else that's happened, it's like if violence happens to a right wing person, it's minimized or laughed off, and then like, well, but oh my God, you can't do that to our people. So
And
yeah,
as I was listing a week that was rife with, as I said,
yeah,
really eight attacks in 7 days, but uh, other than Paul Pelosi, there were 7 different political attacks that I
yeah,
just listed off, and I've written a piece about it. I'm not that I'm working on, and we'll see where that goes. But they all get ignored except for Paul Pelosi. And another thing happens, which is 2 Pacific Northwest video journalists on an Antifa account. An Antifa account comes out and takes responsibility for bashing their windshields out on Saturday night to cap off the week. So it ends with this kind of ominous threat that says, this was it was the kind of F around and find out kind of thing. Here, I'll read the exact thing. It's kind of chilling. I've never seen a Antifa threat from, taking responsibility just blatantly. And, these 2 video journalists had their windshields bashed out, and this account, which is known as Revolution Rising, said these 2 journalists are now in need of new windshields and paint jobs. To them, we say that you have been warned and time again, and it's time to find out if you're seen in our spaces, these acts will continue. Now, I'm someone who's gotten a threat like that in Los Angeles when I was covering stuff there, and it's unsettling. I got a stabbing threat that a week before August 14th of 2021, which was a big city hall brawl in Los Angeles, where a activist, an anti-fascist activist known as Nina Cohen, plunged a knife into the vicinity of the heart of a Hispanic patriot dude as the 2 sides met in the middle of the street, and a brawl was about to begin. And I think she goes to court. She just had her name legally changed to Nina Cohen, and I believe that she has an appearance. I followed up. I believe she has an appearance this month, a hearing in regards to it. But a lot of people don't know about it. That it was a militant, an Antifa militant, who's trans, who was at all of the We Spa riots, where I was on the ground during that, where the We Spa. Boy, we got to talk about that. I think we talked about it one of the last times.
yeah,
This fella named Darren Marager, who this is where it gets really interesting. And anybody who's listening right now, here's a scoop. And I've been, I have a relationship with LA Magazine, and I worked with them covering We Spa. But I've been talking to Darren Marager over the past couple of months, and because Andy No did a piece and sort of fixated on a couple of sex crimes from 20 years ago. He was caught publicly masturbating and exposing himself 20 years ago. That this person, Darren Marager, is the one who was at WeSpa, who was on the women's side presenting mail. Over conversations over the last couple of months, Marager identifies as a heterosexual male. This is somebody who said to me, some of my girlfriends and ex-girlfriends have not known that I'm trans, which was like kind of one of these statements that are like, that's a mind wraparound so what, and we've been asking and so what makes you trans? And Darren Marager's sort of defines himself as being a heterosexual male that is androgynous, that is legally female. And the first day that was offered in California, went and changed his or her, because he's okay with somebody using both pronouns, went and changed the license to be female. So Darren Marager is legally female. Darren Marager showed up not just at the WeSpa, but in other spas, presenting mail. And I asked about Marager's trans history. And Marager got into an accident back in 2017, a very severe accident in which he was at risk of gangrene in his lower extremities. The way he describes it, he was mandated to have a therapist and work with a therapist. And the conversation came up to what about, how he would live his life if he had to amputate his, male appendage. And the thing that I kept asking him is, I said, did you ever bring up to the therapist, trans identity from childhood, from any other part in your life? And Marager said, no. The therapists, plural, brought it up to me, and then it clicked all at once. He said in a night it clicked, that Marager had this epiphany that he, as an androgynous kind of, he defined himself as an androgynous, was a bit of a name dropper too, grew up in Southern California, Los Angeles, Sunset Strip, drummer and glam bands kind of thing. So he took this kind of androgynous view of his past and married it with current trans ideology, and legally defines himself or herself as female. And because of California laws the way they are, Marager is in LA Magazine, we pointed out, is technically not breaking any laws by going into female spaces, because that's the way the laws are written in California. And this is kind of a breaking tidbit. The most recent conversation with Marager is Marager is thinking about suing the state of California because he has been charged in regards to indecent exposure at WeSpa. And the story, whether you believe Marager or the women, it took the women, a month or a month and a half to file. But I broke the story that 5 police reports were filed for indecent exposure in regards to WeSpa. Now, the question is, well, what makes it indecent exposure? And there's nothing that says that he did anything that was lewd behavior. By the laws of the state of California, technically, if he was not erect or was not, doing anything lewd or masturbatory, he, according to the state of California, didn't do anything illegal. And
Yeah.
so it's an interesting case.
Yeah, and that's the sort of thing. It really bothers me to see this sort of entitlement, because the biggest thing in like the trans community in the past was, it was about being respectful. It was one of those things of like, hey, it's like, try to cause as least amount of problems as possible. There was not this sort, like, the whole thing, what people said was, when you transition, you just don't switch bathrooms. The basically what people did was keep using the regular bathroom that you use at the regular facilities until people start stopping you and like, oh no, and point you to the other one. Like when other people are registering you as, your internal gender, when you're presenting a certain way and people start to read you that way, that's when you switch, because the point is like not causing problems. You're not trying to make people uncomfortable. And that's one of the things I just kind of have to shake my head at. It's like and I hear this from other people that transitioned of a certain generation. It's just, you know, being very aggressive and entitled is not what people were about in the past. It was, part of it, I guess, was there was much less acceptance. So it's what people had to do because, you couldn't really push that hard on it. And that's sort of the thing that bothers me is there's lots of people now who they're trying to push that. They're not just willing to accept like, hey, let's just be considerate, because that works both ways. There's people, like I was saying earlier, it's like there's people who may not be rah go trans rights, but and maybe they've got moral objections or something like that, but they're willing to not cause a problem as long as you don't force them to care or force them to, confront something. And like that's really what tolerance really is. It's like there's this insistence now that everyone has to be fully in agreement, and it's this kind of it's a very totalizing ideology, and I don't see how that's going to really end in a good way, because if you force everyone to care, and it's a very binary choice of you're either 100% with us or we're going to attack you. That's a really bad road to go down, because that's going to make things worse before they even possibly get better, if they even get better at all. So I don't, and it sort of goes to there's another aspect of it too, which I was thinking about earlier, and I should have brought it up. Was some of the things you're seeing on the left now, it's they think of people in terms of the class identity, and I've heard people actually kind of articulate this, and it's very interesting. It's like, how can you support women's rights and attack women, or how can you support black lives but attack a black guy, like with the MAGA Hulk guy, like that situation. Well, part of the thing about constructing an identity or a class of people is it's much easier to kind of abstractly exclude certain people. Biden kind of hinted at that when he was like, if you don't vote for me, you're not black. Well, it's not like black people certainly, not like their skin suddenly bleached because they didn't vote for him. He was talking about blacks as in terms of a political class, as like an identitarian sort of class that can more of a construct, like a political sort of construct, where it's like I've heard people talk, like Andrew Sullivan and like Milo Yiannopoulos are not gay, or Peter Thiel. There was an article a couple years ago that said Peter Thiel's not gay. He's homosexual. He's not gay because he's Republican. And that's part of that. You see this thing now where it's like there's this abstract class of people that's a political construct, and if they don't meet the definition, they're not subject to the protections of the class, which is what you see with women being physically attacked because they support they talk about being a woman, and they think it's important because, hey, I was born with a vagina and I menstruate, and that makes me a woman, but they're physically attacked by other people in support of notional women's rights. And that's sort of what you're seeing is like, yeah, because it seems absurd on its face, as you noted earlier, and that's really the kind of genesis of it, is like there's an abstract class of people, and as long as they're defending this abstract class, they can attack individual people that may, to the average bystander, look like they're part of the class. So if that makes any sense at all.
And there's a cultural solidarity on the left, which seems to indicate that, yeah, if you're not with us, you're against us right now. And it was interesting because in last night I was in Honokaa, which is the northern part of the Big Island, a small town. Gosh, what's the population of it? I gotta check it out because it's not very big at all. But this drag queen who grew up there came and brought all of the homies from the Denver drag scene. So this was like a huge, a drag show. Now, one of the questions that I asked the owners in Eugene was, wouldn't a drag show be more appropriate outside of a bar setting? Wouldn't it be, if community or family truly want to, because parents make their own decisions. Mine certainly did, as far as what I was allowed to see was much more broad than what my peers were allowed to see as a kid growing up. But if wouldn't a community theater be a better setting for it? Well, this was at a community theater last night, and it was a mostly adult show. Like as opposed to the Eugene show, which was Drag Time Story Hour, these were club performers on a proscenium stage with tables in front, like lounge tables, to recreate that kind of cabaret feel, and then a whole audience of people in the back. And there, you'll see in my video, there's teens and tweens that are kind of, they were running around with like buckets to collect tips. It was set up that this is no contact tipping. Nobody's gonna touch the performers or anything like that. And there were only I did see 3 children, and one was a couple that was dressing up themselves and they had a kid, and then one was a woman who was dressed up herself and had a kid, and then one was a woman that was sitting right behind me. And then in the video, you even hear the kids start asking questions. And so it brings up a lot of issues. And I'm curious on your take about this, because what we're seeing is a kind of an ostentatious cultural solidarity around drag and queer culture is being very much mainstreamed. And I'd never seen anything like this. I mean, I've been to drag shows. I lived in New York and in San Francisco. And so, but I'd never seen it in a mainstream proscenium, so to speak. And also, this was the local business association that was sponsoring this event. It was all ages, though. Again, I will say that there were only three kids whose parents brought them. But I'll roll a little of the clip because it's quite visual and quite different than anything that I've ever seen, and contrasts very dramatically with Eugene. This was a nighttime event. There was no drinking in the venue, but there was a pop-up pub about a block away where people at the intermission could go and have a beer. So there were some things that I saw that I was like, this is an enjoyable event and they're doing it right. But I think when I shared it with a conservative friend, he was quite stunned at what I'm calling the cultural solidarity here of queer culture. And at one point the MC does, it's like if you're at a really cool show, but then it's like a Christian show. And then all of a sudden it takes a turn when the MC is like, let's talk about who has invited Christ into their heart. The show almost took that turn where the MC was like, well, anybody who has a question about trans or about it took that kind of religious turn where the MC was offering up, hey, let's talk about, what is gender and stuff like this. And that became a section of the show that I was quite surprised with. So all these people, I just want to say, were very kind. And I do have interviews with them that I hope I'll either show locally or at some point have in full on Twitter. They're very gracious to allow me to film and to give me interviews. But it's up for discussion. And so let's play a little of the clip right now. And she's local to the Big Island. And there is a kid that is in a yellow dress and is kind of bored. but until her mom gives her some bread. I didn't realize that the kid was And you can see that, you know, some of the communities are asked,
Yeah.
for kind of thing. And I will say that, you know, if I was a right-wing like web journalist that's looking for a viral video, there are sections of this that I could click one by one. So as to create outrage and, you know, go ask Andy No to reproduce.
Yeah.
But I'm curious on your take.
Yeah. You know, it's I think one of the things that really stands out to me is, I mean, again, I'm from the rural Mississippi Delta, and like my local high school had one of the things that the seniors did was a drag show. You know, this is a very conservative rural area, but it was a big joke. You know, it was one of those things. I think it was there wasn't bawdy in a sense, there wasn't sexualized, because it's a very conservative thing, and it was part of a fundraiser too. Is like, you know, have the drag show where you dress up the senior redneck boys as girls and make you know, do some fundraising for the school, and everyone has a good laugh at it. It wasn't really bawdy. It wasn't bawdy at all. It wasn't really sexualized. It was like almost like a beauty pageant sort of thing.
We had that too in
And
high school. We had something called Powder Puff, where the football players would dress up as the cheerleaders, and the cheerleaders would dress up as the football players. I don't know if you could do that anymore. Somebody might, you know?
Ironically, it would probably be, you know, less likely to happen these days, precisely because it's so like politically charged at this point. And those sorts of things, you know, those were all like very, very comedic sort of settings, you know, and like I feel like I've been to drag shows and I enjoy drag shows, and you know, I want to go see them in a bar, and I want them to have the comedy and the humor in it, you know, that's entertaining. And like I feel like if you made it appropriate for children, it would take a lot of the fun out of it. You know, I don't want to see a G-rated drag show, because what's the point in it? That kind of takes it out. Like the gay community sort of drag shows has to have that sort of bawdy sort of comedy and like over the topness to it. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting here is, and I mean, I think things should be in their own place, you know? Like I want to see a drag show, I want to see it like it needs to be like fun, you know. I mean, it needs, like, that looks fun as well, but it needs to be, in my opinion, if it's separate and it's in its original setting of like a gay bar and it's got the full effect, then it makes it much more entertaining. I think in a sense, to do it properly in a setting around kids or the general public, it has to be so watered down, there's no point to it. And I kind of sense that it's not, the ones that I've seen, a lot of them, like there's definitely some drag shows that I've seen, the all ages drag shows where the performers did not calibrate their performance to the audience. In my opinion, they're completely irresponsible. So
well, that's what makes those viral clips. That's what makes those viral clips, like of a stripper pole in, I think, Pennsylvania, maybe in Pittsburgh at a pride parade where kids are getting on it, or the viral clips from, I think, Texas, maybe from Austin, where you know, the kid is touching the mermaid thing, and you know, these moments get clipped, and I could probably find one in there. But that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in having, and I hope somebody doesn't clip it and try to make a big deal out of this. I'm trying to have a real, you know, serious conversation about what are the limits? What are the there seems to also be a kind of, you know, if you had a show like this that was like high school age and up, I don't know. I mean, I feel like high school kids can make their own decisions and are in that, you know, but maybe that's because I'm so culturally liberal. But it does, to see, you know, the little girl that was in the front row, she wasn't there before, because I was sitting there before, and I left that seat. And so her mom obviously brought her all the way to the front just to be, you know, participating more. And I don't know. I mean, thoughts?
Yeah, it's though most of the clips that I've seen, I don't really think it's I don't think it's appropriate for the age of these kids. Like, like I said, I don't even really approve of the beauty pageants as well, but I definitely don't think a lot of this stuff, like I've seen some that are way over. I mean, that doesn't look like it was in a bar, which in my opinion makes it a little bit more appropriate. I don't think kids should be going to a drag show in a bar.
Yeah, I was
Um,
a community theater space, which I
yeah,
think is a step in the right direction, shall I say.
yeah, no, I think that is much better. Um, uh, yeah, the ones, especially with the younger performers, when they actually have the kids performing, especially when they're performing in a bar, in my opinion, that's well over the line. If they toned it down, I think if it was calibrated for a sort of a generic audience, that would probably be okay. But like I said, my opinion, I think that would really kind of take the fun out of it. Um, I think one of the things too, and I'll probably get a little nerdy here on this. There's really two books that I think actually have some interesting insights on a lot of the things we're seeing on these sorts of behavior from a lot of the activist left. The first one's Days of Rage, which is a book that you probably heard of that deals a lot with the new left, like the Weather Underground and a lot of the other violent leftist activist groups in like the 60s, the 70s, and the early 80s. And there's another one called uh, it's called Power and the Idealists. It's by Paul Berman, and it's actually about the European New Left and deals with roughly the same time period. It actually, the main characters covered in it are a man named Joschka Fischer, who was, he was a German politician, and there was a scandal where there was a photo of him of a riot around like 1970 of him punching like he pulled the helmet off a police officer and he's beating him down, and that photo got out in the news and it was a minor scandal. um, and they're both dealing with the new left. One of them's the American New Left, the other one's the European New Left, at roughly the same time period. And what's interesting in both is it's not the main topic of either one, but both of them cover the sexuality issue, because a lot of them they had an ideological reasoning behind being so sexually permissive and transgressive. Uh, in fact, in Power and the Idealist, there was Joschka Fischer's, like his right hand person was a man named Daniel Cohn-Bendit, and it was very interesting because this person was he went and created a kindergarten, but it wasn't just any sort of kindergarten. It was a kindergarten where they were basically sexualizing children. They were having like, trying to encourage, what they said was they were trying to encourage the healthy sexuality of kindergartners, of children, because the whole idea behind it was that fascism is created by sexual repression. So the more sexually liberated people are, the less likely they are to be fascist. Like there was actually, this guy was writing articles about what he was doing, and like children would like literally unzip his fly and like, grasp his genitals, and he was writing about this sort of stuff. It's really kind of bizarre. And
Where was this person from?
this was these were the Europeans. This was Daniel Cohn-Bendit, and Joschka Fischer wasn't involved with it, but just for an example.
And what years? What era?
This was like in the 70s and in the 80s. But what's interesting here is Daniel Cohn-Bendit became a member of the European Parliament. He was the leader of the Green Party in Germany and part of the European Parliament. Joschka Fischer was the vice chancellor of Germany. So these are not fringe political people. These are people who moved on and had tremendous influence as mainstream political characters. And the same sort of thing is discussed in Days of Rage. Like it's not the main part of the book, but they discuss like the sexuality issue of like, the Weathermen had a big thing where everyone's going to have sex with everyone else because we're trying to defeat capitalism and fascism. So let's all have a big orgy. And like that was the sort of thing where, the same sort of sexual permissiveness. And this is, I don't think the people that are doing a lot of this stuff today can articulate it the same way. But there has been, and you see this in an example too. Like you see this with Greta Thunberg is she talks about like, well, we need to, you know, we need to create a green economy to defeat capitalism. We have to get rid of nuclear power and all this sort of stuff. And it all comes back to like defeating capitalism, defeating fascism, which is anything that's not like turbo communism the way they mean it in usage. But there's a little bit of deflection, but I wanted to really touch on some of the intellectual stuff with this, which is kind of explains what you're seeing. It's like the origin behind this stuff is like a lot of these people want to encourage a very sexual permissiveness for explicitly political reasons.
Gotcha. Now we got a question. Someone wants to research it. Says, can you type the name in the chat? Do you have the chat there on post a comment?
Yeah. Okay.
So
yeah,
if you could type the names into the chat and post them so people can take a look and see who it is we're talking about. What's interesting though is that they kind of smash the binary or F the system kind of thing that comes out of it. Then kind of gets mainstreamed in a way, because as I said, like I saw this host kind of pop into what is gender questions. And again, it just feels like, I had this moment when I was at summer camp when I was a kid, like where I was having the greatest time, right? I'm away from my family where, I'm fishing, I'm riding horses, like going on hikes, water tubing down the endless canal or whatever. It's great for like 6 days. And then on the 7th day, it's like, now it's time for us to talk about Jesus. Like that's how it was. And it was like, oh, whoa, this is, and I think I remember talking to my parents about it. They didn't realize that, they was just like, oh, send them to camp. It's but I'm seeing similarities in this, the way that an ideology gets embraced. And then, it's all fun and culture until there's that moment of, do you believe, now is the time that we talk about whether you've asked Jesus into your heart and do you believe, which is, totally great. But when you do this to kids, I feel the same. I feel kind of an analogous situation of cultural domineering.
Very much. I think part of this too is like, there's the aspect of it where they're like, it's a subtle political program because it's about, well, hey, like you went to hang out with these people and you loved their company and you enjoyed the show and you had a great time. And it's like, well, hey, do you want to support them and defend them? Well, you're going to have to destroy capitalism if you want to do that. So here's how you do it. It is kind of there's an element of recruitment to it in that sense.
Yeah, recruitment is maybe, because the other one's already kind of getting overused. And so there has to be a way to talk to people about the cultural phenomenon, because, there were, as I said, I found things that were appropriate and were fun about this event, that were harmless, but then I couldn't look away from the fact that, you had teenagers that were walking around collecting the tips, and on each side of, where the stairs are to help the drag queens up and down the stairs, and that the kids, it was making an impression on a 6-year-old kid. And I think there's a moment here in this clip where you can hear a kid saying something coming up. And, again, these people were all very nice and kind, and it was a very fun show. But here, I think we get into
go around. Get the bucket. Now, our entertainers may.
Oh, that it's on the fritz, but you could see there that's the tip bucket, and then you got a teen and a bustier that's carried around. For some reason, the clip went on the fritz. I don't know why.
Does anybody smell the drag?
And then he or she makes a joke about, can you smell? Have you ever smelled a
work of art? Are you gonna throw soup?
There's something wrong with the clip. I don't know why. So we're gonna have to just leave it at that. But something that's happening is then I hear the kid behind me, who's probably 6 or 7, say something about something dressing like a girl. So the kids are like confused, trying to figure this out. I mean, I remember stuff when I was 5 and 6 and I was trying to figure it out. You know, I still have pretty vivid memory. It's not like kids are just, you know, flies on the wall that are, that you can
Yeah.
kind of tag along. And so I think these are interesting questions and discussions. The way that they're going to be pitched are in political sound bites, and it's going to be weaponized a lot in the next 2 years.
Indeed. You know, I think one of the things about like keeping it to adults only is like it you know, doesn't cheapen the whole thing. Because if you want to do it, because the kids are going to be a little confused. Like, I don't think it's going to like fry their brain just because they happen to see a G-rated drag show. I mean, like for examples I gave, it's like there's plenty of times where like the mainstream society uses drag or cross-dressing for various reasons, and like, you know, like what's the God, there's that film from like the 40s or 50s where like what was this? The two well-known actors, like God, what was it called? I'm drawing a blank. I can picture the actors, but it was like these two actors that played a lot together in films, and they spent most of the film like trying to pass themselves off as the women. And this isn't like the
You're
40s
talking
or
about
the 50s.
some like it
Yeah,
hot.
yeah,
With
yeah.
Jack
That's it.
Lemmon.
Sorry, yeah, that's it. That's it.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, it's like you have stuff from there where it's like, you know, no one thinks it's like going to like mess you up just because you watch it.
Yeah, because I mean, the reason I know that title is my folks showed me Some Like It Hot when I was a kid, you know, and it's
Yeah,
or like Bosom Buddies. Tom Hanks was in drag for his very first TV role.
yeah. It's like those have God, and there was the one with you know, the other God, you know, there's plenty of mainstream films that have used that as a gimmick, and like I don't think that's probably not damaged kids, you know, that like, so in a sense, like there's nothing inherently bad about some sort of drag performance, but
And the point that the
Mhm,
one of the women who's on the board for
mhm.
the theater made is that it goes back to Shakespeare's time
Yeah,
when actors would dress up as women and play the female parts because women were not allowed on the stage, and so
yeah,
you
yeah.
know it's so there is, but there's something different. And
Oh, absolutely.
when I watch the clips too, there is some kind of gloating too, like there was this thing of we're saying no to hate and we're doing this. It becomes this pious appreciation of what we're doing, whereas the people that were protesting outside were from all different parts of the Big Island. I talked to them too, mostly Christian conservatives who had bonded together over COVID restrictions and opposing them. And they were even saying, look, we're not the Westboro Baptist Church. Some of them did have fundamentalist views as far as man and a woman views, and we're on the bullhorn, but they weren't really telling people they were going to hell, but some of their signage was maybe a little fire and brimstone. So, it becomes, again, the conversation becomes pitched at a very intense place where people are taking extreme positions. And I think the word you used was like maximal.
Maximalist positions, and I
Maximalist.
think, yeah, maximalist. It's the thing that strikes me about it too is like, you know, the other examples that we raised like weren't explicitly political. Like there wasn't, or there, you know, maybe this isn't really fully explicitly political, but there's definitely a strong political undertone and political valence to it. And I think that is a big difference. Is like people sort of understand that it's not just drag, you know, without, it's not in a neutrally presented form of drag as like comedy or some other sort of thing, or for like a film or something where it's, you know, there's a funny hijink where the character has a dress in drag for whatever reason. Like the drag shows here, like they're less likely to be appropriate. There's lots of them that are probably borderline or inappropriate, and it's so obviously politically charged because there's a political agenda behind it as well. And I think that's what people sense and are recognizing and responding to. You know, America is super like polarized right now, and everything is politically charged in one way or the other. America is such a hyper political space right now that anything I think that even reeks of that at all is going to draw this sort of attention.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that. Let's see. I'm gonna just put this comment up one more time. Joe is asking, could you type the name of that guy about the kindergarten thing again? Didn't show in the chat. I don't know.
Oh, did I?
Did you
Oh,
press
I
the
put it.
send? Did you press send?
I was in the chat and I chat with everyone in the studio. Oh, I did it in the wrong one.
Oh,
Okay, so I did it in the chat.
oh no, lower right hand comment where it says post a comment. You can write there, and then you hit the envelope for send.
Okay, trying to. I see.
Oh, are you on a phone?
I'm on a phone.
Oh, okay. Okay.
So
If you want, you
I
could
put
text
it.
it to me and I'll type it in. Or
I actually
no,
put it.
you're on
It's
your
in the
phone.
chat. It's in the chat. So maybe it's with us. It's with everyone in the studio. The chat within the studio. You should be able. Maybe you can copy paste that.
I don't see that. Let's see. We'll
Weird.
figure this out in a second. Oh, okay. I see. It's in the private chat. All right.
Oh yeah. Okay.
I'll copy and paste that
Okay.
for you.
Yeah, I'm
So,
on my iPhone right now. So
okay, you're on the iPhone. Gotcha. So okay, that's the comments. Yeah, I clicked the comments and I'm gonna put that in. The other thing that I wanted to bring up, here's the names of the figures and public report. Just gonna give a plug to my website. I put together on publicreport.org, which I was originally documenting stuff over 2020. There's a timeline now on publicreport.org, which is all political violent events from 2015 leading into the Trump presidential run. A lot of violence took place. First, rhetorically from Trump, in other words, the way that counter protesters were manhandled at Trump rallies. That then escalated. There's a fellow in North or South Carolina that I don't remember, but elbowed a black dude who was counter protesting. Those two ended up hugging it out by the end of the year, whereas the rest of the country just kind of accelerated into
yeah.
vitriol. But that's an interesting case. I can't remember the fellow's name off the top of my hand, because after that, then you have rallies in San Jose, California, and Costa Mesa, California, that get violent, in which Trump supporters are attacked. And then you start to get more and more of a pattern once Trump becomes president of shut it down leftism coming in to shut down, conservatives. And the unreported pattern is that the activist left and militant left has been coming in since, really getting into it since 2017, showing up regularly to shut down events. And then there's a disproportionate response from the right at times. And there's even provocation from the right at times, knowing that the leftists are coming from a place of intolerance and are going to lose their mind. So a huge part of what you're seeing in the media, I talked earlier about the week in which there were 7 different political attacks, all are ignored. And then we end on the fact that 2 Pacific Northwest journalists are intimidated and have their windshields smashed. There's good reason that this generation of millennial journalists do not want to rock the boat and stick to their political tribe and don't want to report anything that goes against that. But essentially you have, reporters from the Daily Beast to the Huffington Post to Vice that have been running cover for all this stuff that has been going on, because they're not dealing with it honestly. And a lot of times, especially during the pandemic, they weren't even there, and outlets don't even have the money to send a digital reporter across the country. So that's why, when I do this stuff, I flew to Eugene on my own dime, didn't make a penny off of it, but it's in service of a larger project that I've been investing in since 2020, which is trying to tell the story about what's really been happening out on the streets, by actually going to these events and communicating with others who are nonpartisans who do good work across the country. And there's not a lot of them, but there's a handful of them who either live stream these events and don't turn their camera away from one side, because there's intimidation that is used. If you're one of the journalists in the Pacific Northwest, there's good reason, if you were at Eugene and you pointed your camera just at the right wing, it's because you have to live with these people showing up and intimidating you and breaking the windows of your car. And so that's just on a micro level, but on a macro level, a whole generation has bought in to some level to believing that any means are somewhat necessary in this kind of fight against the systemic problems that they are very convinced of. Came out of college quite, I guess, as true believers. I remember I was at this bar in LA, and I was talking to these two. It was karaoke, and I was singing, and one of these they were grad students in psychology and behavioral therapy and stuff, and I think they were going to one of the Claremont Pepperdine. That's what it was. So we're having a blast and we're having drinks together, and then it comes up that I say something about that I was at the Capitol and that I documented at the Capitol, and all of a sudden they were like, freaked out about it. And I'm like, no, I'm a reporter. I was there. But they were like, well, why did you go there? How did you know to go? And I said, well, actually, I was following, these two groups had been fighting. So, January 6th didn't just happen by itself. There was also November the 14th, where the MAGA people were beat up after the Million MAGA March. And then Proud Boys and, kind of retaliated. And then you had December the 12th, which was an all out, melee. So I was expecting part 3 of that. And I'm sitting in my hotel and I'm looking through Twitter and I'm realizing it's going down. So of course I got my ass over to the Capitol and in the Capitol, because that's what I do. And then they're looking at me and they're like, well, what do you think about systemic racism? And I was like, oh God, oh boy, here we go. I have to give credentials that I was there for the right, on the right side, so to speak, and not as my neutral self. By the way, we talked about the midterms a little. I've announced this. I'm not going to vote. I'm in Hawaii, so
it doesn't really matter.
It's a
I guess
monoculture, just like San
yeah.
Francisco, just like other spots. So yeah, it doesn't really matter. But I am announcing that I'm not voting, because I do want to go into the next coverage cycle as a genuine nonpartisan in this. And with the hope of voting third party in the next election cycle. So we'll see how it goes.
We'll see. We'll definitely see. I'm interested to see how it turns out. So
well,
I think go ahead.
I was gonna say I want to cover it. I mean, it's too hard
Yeah.
for me to just be doing local news, and that's why I was kind of like, I went, met up with you in Phoenix, and then there was an LA rally of two groups facing off, and that was a Gays Against Groomers group led by Mario out there that was holding a protest in September, right after I saw you in Phoenix, and then I got out there to Eugene the other weekend, and I was ready to go to Penn State. I was ready to call in and just say, hey, I can't make it to work this week, because I saw Penn State. I saw that stuff was going on in Portland with that group, and somebody mentioned wrote her name, Kelly J. Keene, I guess is part of this this group of women, free speech women's movement. How do you feel when and I know they self-describe as TERF sometimes, but how do you feel when gender critical or Team TERF gets to a point of saying we don't want any any men in our spaces, and that includes trans women? What's your reaction to that?
It's one of those things where I think that I wish it didn't come to that point, and I kind of feel like the really aggressive trans rights activist people are kind of forcing a lot of them to really choose, because a lot of this next generation of trans activism has gotten so turbo aggressive. I think, as far as I want to give people as much space as possible to have their own little private areas. In terms of a systemic sort of policy, a nationwide policy. I mean, I wouldn't support their objectives, but I absolutely support giving them their spaces for sure. Like I understand where they're coming from. It's like my friend, said before, completely passable, attractive trans woman was like, we're not real women, right? So and she used to say that all the time to lots of other trans women. And I understand the perspective of like, the reality is like the whole trans women or women thing is like, well, the problem with that statement is you can't say all women are trans women either. So it's like there's fundamentally different experiences. And like I feel more I feel a little grateful and honored to have gotten a chance to sort of experience both sides. Because I didn't grow up, like obviously I didn't have a female puberty. I didn't grow up and experience the world as like a young girl growing up. I got to experience more of the male experience. So I don't. I've always treated myself sort of. I've always approached the situation as like I'm a guest in someone else's house, so I'm going to try to be respectful and cause little bit of problem, as least problems as I can for them. And I kind of, the modern trans right activism is like the person who comes in and feels entitled to stay in your house, and that's kind of how. Yeah, it's one of those things where I feel like we could have found some sort of middle ground, but I'm very uncomfortable with, and I do sympathize with. Actually sympathize a little bit with a lot of the gender critical turf people. Like I understand their basis for arguing that, like they were born women and they've only experienced life as women. Like they have periods and can get pregnant, which is something trans women don't have to experience. So I understand why they think that's something they want to treat as very intrinsic to their being and how it's very important. So I think that's the best approach from my perspective. Is I tend to, try to sympathize with them, and I'm trying to be respectful towards them. And I feel like some of this insanity that we're seeing, because there's a lot of trans people, especially like the male, some of them, not all of them, of course, but there's a really distressing increase in this very entitled, aggressive, violent male to female cohort that's coming up now. I see some of them that have some incredibly violent rhetoric towards women. Like there's groups of trans women these days that carry around bats and they paint them in the trans flag colors, and they have memes and they paint pictures about kill all turfs, which is a turf is really a woman who thinks there's something intrinsic nature to being a woman that should be respected. And like that sort of stuff, like that's not female, like when like that's like a very male type of violence that they're bringing into women's spaces. And so I really do understand. Well, I mean, I don't fully understand, but I do sympathize with where a lot of them are coming from. And I just think it's one of the things of like I said, I consider myself something of a guest in someone else's house, and I want to be respectful and make as little bit of waves as possible.
And what do you think when it comes to the other conversation, which is because there's one we're talking about, we've talked about drag shows, we've talked about,
Yeah.
Spaces, women's spaces. When it comes to the biggest issue that most people, especially on the left, are scared shitless to talk about, it is transitioning kids and puberty blockers for kids under the age of 18. And most people, I feel, don't even know where to start with that and are in fear that they'll say the wrong thing or they'll be on the wrong, side, or that this isn't up for discussion. And then recently you have, Jon Stewart, I think it was John Oliver maybe, or, the Comedy Central team, there's a mainstreaming of stuff that overlooks, what we're seeing on Twitter, which is, detransitioners coming forward one by one, telling their stories and getting pilloried for it. So, where do you see all that and your voice in regards to?
Yeah, that's another thing that concerns me because I'm just very deeply concerned that that's going to end very badly. It's obviously something that's very traumatic for a lot of people. And I also think that's going to end badly probably for the rest of the trans community because, anything involving children is very radioactive. Um, like we know for a fact that mass shootings and suicides are things that have a social contagion factor, especially in young people. Like this is not a controversial take. You know, children will commit, like when there's a mass shooting and when it's publicized, especially if it's like a school shooting, there's going to be a bunch of other mass shootings in the immediate like it spikes. And with suicides as well, if there's a bunch of suicides in a school or, it's publicized, there's going to be a lot more suicides in the very near future after that happens. So we know that. Like there's no debate over that. So the idea that people, you know, younger people especially may have the same social contagion issue with trans stuff, like, if you're going to kill yourself or kill a lot of other people, then well, I mean, taking hormones is less disruptive than both of those by far. So it shouldn't even be a debate. I mean, that is something that I think actually happens, and it really deeply concerns me. Um, and it's one of those things too where uh, there's so much there's so much around this that's just very unsettling to me. One of those things is like, again, from even less than 10 years ago, there was so much talk about, be absolutely sure, go talk to a therapist, take your time, go to a doc. Like it was about taking your time, going slow, don't making any big leaps of faith without any preparation. And now it's all like, part of this too is like one of the things that has happened is there's been so much of a pushback against what people call conversion therapy. And it's one of those things that's sold as, conversion therapy is when you take someone to a camp and you like lock them in some Bible camp and like keep them awake at night and try to brainwash them into being straight or being cisgender again. And that's kind of how it's sold. And there are examples of that, but the way it's actually happening in practice in terms of a lot of lots of bans on conversion therapy, it's written in such a way that anything short of affirmation of a person's self-declared gender identity is considered, conversion therapy. So if I'm a therapist and someone comes to me and they're like, hey, I want to be a woman or something, or a girl comes to me and says, I want to be a boy, and this person has tons of other issues, you're not allowed to say, hey, maybe you're just like, maybe you're not, maybe you're just this list of other mental issues you have is the problem. So a lot of them are really afraid of that. So they just basically, streamline people into like there's no pushback, there's no any form. It's something called gatekeeping, which was fairly common in the past, where it's like doctors wouldn't sign off. Like you had to go to a therapist and spend a lot of time with them, then get a letter to go to a doctor to take hormone therapy. And a lot of that still exists, but it's so streamlined and there's no real pushback. Like I've talked to people that have gone to the doctor lately and like gone to transition, and they didn't push back at all. They just like take your word for everything. And, you have a couple meetings and then you go, there at no point does anyone actually say, hey, maybe you should consider this or slow down or take your time. And that really worries me because, we've seen a huge explosion, especially in the female to male cohort of people transitioning and getting surgeries very early. And lots of these, lots more detransitioners coming out. And the thing that bothered, like, there's a lot of debate over detransitioning. Like, I was actually reading, and this is sort of interesting to jump back to this. There's something called the Standards of Care for the World Professional Transgender Health Organization. Yeah,
this is
the DSM-5. Okay, well, I'm kind
what's
of.
this
Go ahead.
this question is, what about your view on DSM-5 erasure of sex gender dysphoria being replaced with an incongruence?
I think that's part of the issue. Like, it's kind of ironic. It's like demedicalizing being trans, which I can sort of understand the perspective, but at the same time, there's no real framework anymore for like, hey, like any forms of check and balances. Like one of the things like with the stand, this is sort of interesting. Um, the latest standards of care, the one that came out this last summer, like the SO standards of care number 8, is the first one that actually mentions detransitioning. And it's very interesting because when it actually is very anti-detransitioner. What they actually have, the framework they have for someone who wants to detransition is what was called gatekeeping 10 years ago. Like, they actually say in there, detransitioning is something almost no one does. If someone wants to do it, they're like literally telling therapists, you need to push back on someone who wants to detransition. If someone wants to detransition, they literally say, make this person live as their original gender for a certain amount of time before you allow them to have hormone therapy. And like, that just kind of blew my mind when I read it, because I'm like, wait a minute, that's what was called gatekeeping 10 years ago. Like, it's literally in the standards of care, it's a higher standard to detransition than it is to transition. Like, there literally is a higher standard for that, which it's kind of blows my mind. It should be reversed, if anything.
That's interesting. Standards of care.
Yeah.
And what's that in the DSM-5?
The DS, I actually haven't read the latest DSM-5. So, but I'm the World Professional Association of Transgender. I cannot say transgender tonight for some reason, which is deeply ironic. Um, World Professional Association of Transgender Health. They have something called the Standards of Care, and it comes out every couple of years. It's just very interesting to read. The latest one out is SOC 8, which is the 8th edition, and it's really interesting to read about detransition in there, because it's gatekeeping. Like, it's literally like they took the framework from 10 years ago and made that the detransition framework today. So it's very interesting to see that mismatch. My personal opinion is there already are way more detransitioners than people think, precisely because of what you see, targeted at the detransitioners that are sharing their stories. There's a lot of people that are just incredibly nasty to them. So people who detransition, they sort of they want to cut off contact with the community, because that's part of it. If you're going to detransition, you want to leave. You don't want to have anything to do with the old community, because it's very awkward and weird. I know several detransitioners, and it's very interesting because, like, they're not in contact with the broader community anymore. These are private people, like, they're back living their old life, for various reasons, and they're not public figures. But, like, if you were still in the trans community, you would never see these people, because they don't really. If you were someone who was in the middle of the community, or in the spaces that trans people hang out at, that you would never see them, because they don't come there anymore. So I think it's hard to get a really good number on that. Like, my personal feeling is the amount of detransitioners out there is probably around like 25% of people who just literally go back to their old life. They usually estimate like around 2%. I'm like, that's way too low. So it's a lot more than that. And I'm really worried, because especially with the explosion in young transitioners, I am deeply concerned that we're going to have, in the next few years, we're going to have a mass wave of detransitioners, and that's going to probably create a big public backlash.
Yeah. Well, there's one more question here about GNRH antagonists. Do you know what that is?
Oh, okay.
This is Freya Lee, by the way,
Oh,
who was
yeah.
at, and I think I might have a clip of her. I interviewed her. She was in Eugene. She's part of Trans Against Groomer.
Yeah.
And let's see. I might have a clip lined up. Let's see. And she's saying, she believes, to be honest, we already have a massive wave of detransitioners.
Yeah, I agree, and that's the sort of thing. It's tragic in its own right, because I don't want to see people that make that sort of mistake and suffer for it. Like in the individual level, I don't want to see those people suffer. But I also don't want to see the massive backlash that that's going to lead to. And that's the sort of thing that bothers me, is like again, why I've tried to avoid identity politics sort of stuff, because I don't want to be like up there like speaking as the trans person, like using that to talk about that. But it's becoming like I just kind of wanted to transition and focus on the topics that I cared about, and then it just sort of became an interesting factor that didn't really apply to what I was actually doing. But it's one of the things of looking at the stuff that's happening, and I'm like, I'm gonna have to start speaking up against this.
Yeah, it's interesting. I would argue with, and I'm been a pretty staunch liberal my whole life, and I would argue with my conservative friends on everything, every topic. I've reversed on quite a few, I think, issues, especially on the right to bear arms, because of what I saw and witnessed out on the streets in 2020, as far as places where people had the right to protect themselves and their businesses and so forth and what. But I'd argue with a friend who I thought was kind of immature in around the time when Caitlyn Jenner was transitioning and so forth. It became really at the forefront of public conversation, and he would post some stuff, and I would just say, there's no way that they're not doing that. They're not transitioning kids. And I would argue consistently, and I feel, I'm honest with myself when I'm wrong, and I was wrong, and I was wrong about, and I wonder how much the public realizes that they're not fully aware of the situation or educated as to what's going on, and all the factors that have sort of made this perfect storm. I mean, because you have the industry of it, you have the wokeism or the virtue kind of competitiveness of it, and it all gets baked into what is current, culturally, what it means to be left now. And so it seems that once you get Jon Stewart doing bits, and that it becomes hard to, when you get more and more names that sort of come out, and I think on Saturday Night Live someone was posting a picture of Don Cheadle in a t-shirt that was trans activist related and so forth. Then it becomes harder and harder to have a conversation, because the forces that are trying to manufacture consent are so hard to push back against. And I'm talking about just to have a conversation, not necessarily take even the position of saying, hey, nobody under 18 should be allowed to transition or so forth. I'm talking about just having the conversation to begin with.
Yeah, I have a friend. She started transitioning when she was 15, and she I think for her it was the best decision. Like, she's getting married here soon. Just a really just a successful, attractive, well-adjusted person, who most people don't even realize that she was trans. And so those people do exist, but that's the sort of thing that concerns me. And this is one of the assumptions that we've had from the past that's no longer true in the trans community. It was like, hey, no one's going to go transition for the wrong reasons. It doesn't happen. But that's the sort of thing from 8 or 10 years ago, when it was much more controversial. It was much more the sort of thing where you were looking at a real negative potentiality from transitioning. And now it's become this crazy celebrated sort of thing. I don't think those assumptions work anymore. Like, we've got to accept the fact that, yeah, there's probably people out there who are going to transition for the wrong reasons. There's probably younger people, especially now, that are susceptible to, as much as I hate to admit it, like some sort of, the social contagion aspect of it. we have to watch out for those people. Like now, and that's what concerns me is like, we move towards like an affirmative consent model, which, you know, may have worked in the past. Like again, when it was so much more controversial than it was, and it was something that was there was less social approval of the situation, it probably worked out and kind of balanced itself a little bit. But now when it's become like kind of a cool thing and there's like a social contagion aspect to it, especially with children, I think that's a really bad mix. Um,
And technology plays a big
yeah,
part too, I'm sure.
yeah, yeah.
Technology and the clout that one gets instantaneously, building
Yeah,
online community and so on.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I can, like I said, I know at least one person that transitioned young, and I think for her, like I said, she transitioned at 15. I think for her, it actually worked out. Like she's actually a Republican, and she's a well-adjusted person with like a good job, and she's getting married, and she's just would be the model for a younger transitioner, and I can think of a couple of the people like that, but I can also think of a lot of people where I'm very suspect about their reasons for transitioning, and for every person like her, there's probably several people who probably should have been gate kept, who should have had to stop and think, and especially at that age when younger people are dealing with a lot of emotional turmoil and their body's changing and they're very uncomfortable, and the way social media is these days with TikTok and Tumblr. um, One of the things, and I hate to even kind of mention this sort of stuff, is there's people there's people in the trans community who enjoy doing something called pink pilling, which is they basically try to convince people to transition, or they call it hatching eggs is another term for it. Those people exist. Like they're it's essentially they're basically predators, and there's people who do that, who really do enjoy doing that. Their whole thing is like, I'm going to try to convince people to transition, and they will find any person who's you know possibly like insecure or has any sort of issue, and then it's like a form of cult brainwashing. Is that the majority of trans people? Absolutely not, but those people do exist, and that's something that people have to be aware of.
What was the first term that you used?
One of the terms that they're now using these days is called like pink pilling. Is like trying to pink pilling.
Pink pilling.
Yeah, it's like
Okay.
trying to convince someone to transition. Like
Pink pilling.
that's more of the newer one. Like it's like egg hatching is what people used to say in the past. Because like closeted trans people that haven't transitioned or aren't out to themselves or anyone else, like the slang term for that is an egg. Is like was the trans community slang term for it. So yeah, and so people used to talk about like hatching eggs. There was always some weird people who were into that sort of stuff. So I mean, that's another one of the unsavory aspects of the situation that people we have to be honest about. And it's or to there's lots of things that there's lots of weird stuff like that, and I'm very worried about in its own right that kids transitioning is something that should be approached with the deepest of concern, and not being permissive about it. Like there was a guy in Canada, Dr. Zucker. They had a Canadian institute that actually dealt with gender dysphoria in children, and they ended up finding out that like 90% of kids who had gender issues, as they grew older and as they had therapy, they ended up not really having gender dysphoric issues. And that's the sort of thing that's really concerns me, is like we no longer have that sort of schema, that medical schema that's actually filtering these people out. And yeah, just to go back to the other point that I was saying earlier, it's like I think we're already seeing a wave of detransitioners, and it's only going to get worse.
Well, certainly, I think this is going to come to the forefront in the next election cycle, and I'll be, the We Spa thing took me by surprise. I I remember following up to it, but I didn't realize that there was as much militancy surrounding the issue
Yeah.
than that I came to see. And again, the Darren Marager story is interesting because Darren Marager told me that he's autistic, and again, somebody who's autistic who had this checkered past by his own admission. He's been in and out of jail at a young age, and he would refuse to cut his hair when he was in jail, and then he goes into these therapy sessions after his accident, and then some of the ideas are introduced to him by therapists, and then latches onto it. And at one point in our conversation, my role as a reporter is to listen, ask questions, but at one point in our conversation, Marager says to me, well, what do you think? Do you think maybe he's looking for my opinion on his gender identity? And I said, I can't answer that. I'm here to report. I can't be your advisor, but
Yeah.
or I can't answer that question. But of course, if I were to delve, maybe once this with some perspective, maybe I'd delve in deeper later on the line. But I am still trying to write about this case, but it is an outlier, but it is also a parable about a complete lack of boundaries, an erasure of boundaries. My dad and my mom to some extent too, who my mom campaigns on the other side of the political spectrum than you do. And, again, they met at UC Berkeley. They're diehard liberals. And but my dad is a doctor. He's just retired, but he saw this stuff coming in, and that all of a sudden being a doctor became very fraught about what you were allowed to say, how you were allowed to treat patients, and the activist ideology that was put into hospitals. Being in Northern California, he worked as a family practitioner for years in County Hospital, and he always said to me, the thing is, our problem on the left is that we just don't know how to say no. We don't know how to say no to anything. And what it comes down to is that most people do want boundaries of some sort, to just uproot culture entirely and say, this is going to be this boundaryless thing that is going to, now be a cultural signal that you're part of the right team or the right side of history or however it gets framed by the cultural left. That becomes it becomes this runaway train.
Yeah, it's one of those things is like that shift from the old left to the new left. You have the old left that was very economic focused and it was very like class based, and the shift to the new left was more about like individual autonomy, and which is good in a lot of ways, but it's one of those things is, it's about identity based and individual autonomy, and the whole thing is like that's good but at the same time, there are these social structures that kind of exist for a reason, and you want to be extremely careful before you take a wrecking ball to a lot of this stuff. And the whole Chesterton's fence thing of like, if you see a fence in a field, it's probably there for a reason, so don't go cutting it down without thinking long and hard about what you're going to do and if you're going to replace it with anything else. Yeah, it's one of those things where, and it's part of it too, is like it's the cult aspect is, being able to say, okay, we've gone far enough, this is good. People aren't like that. There's always like it's the human aspect is, that's not how people work. It's like people want to continue moving in the same direction until something stops them.
And when they have a financial, when they have a kind of a financial infrastructure, when it comes to different, left-wing activist groups, there's an incentive for there always to be a boogeyman, or someone that's one step away to take away people's rights. And this goes for race and gender. I'm finding, I didn't know, but it's funny, when I was finding all the chaos on the street, my parents got very nervous about me to keep putting myself in those situations as I was documenting in 2020. And at one point they said I had contacted both the ADL and the Southern Poverty Law Center, because I was, seeing coordinated action. I didn't know if it was coming from the extreme right or from the extreme left. I later found out it was the extreme left and not, or the militant left, or whatever you want to call it. It wasn't coming from the right. It wasn't being orchestrated in a mass way, as far as the mass movement was coming from the anti-fascists and anarchists. And I had early on said to the ADL and made contact and put forward the stuff that I was finding. And my dad said, okay, well, that's good then. They have it. They will go with it. Go on with your life.
Yeah.
They're the professionals. But then what you don't realize is that those groups are compromised, and that they're not interested in holistically looking at extremism or political violence. They're only interested on pinning one side for, certainly for over the Trump era and this era that I've studied since 2016. So much so that when I went into a Southern Poverty Law Center forum and presented the question about, hey, I saw conservatives get jumped in Sacramento. I also find the rhetoric to be hate-based. I mean, you go to most of these MAGA spaces and people just want to be there. They're not trying to, they're not slurring other people aggressively. But when you go into the leftist spaces, they are slurring and they are condemning and they are take a bigoted approach, especially towards those who they perceive to be fascists or conservatives. So I'm saying this stuff, and I'm telling the Southern Poverty Law Center this, and that I'm seeing conservatives getting beat up in San Francisco, your old stomping ground. I was there in October. So this was a month before the election. It was October, I think, the 14th or 17th, I believe, of 2020, a month before the election. And there was a black guy from, I think he was from Texas actually, but was in the Pacific Northwest scene. His name is Philip Anderson.
Yeah.
I later interviewed him at the Capitol on January 6th, but he's someone who's very active in that right-wing, kind of fighting back and militancy. And so he holds this thing in San Francisco, and he gets his teeth punched out. His two front teeth, he has a bloody mouth, and he's missing his teeth. They punch it out in the first minute before it even starts, the event. I'm just getting there, and this guy has no teeth. And the guy actually got charged with a hate crime. I tried to contact the district attorney's office. It'd be interesting under Chesa Boudin what happened, but he was charged with a hate crime. It was a black assailant on a black, Republican who was holding this rally. But the rally just devolved into anybody they were so severely outnumbered that anybody got attacked and beaten that was Trump MAGA. And then you had all these people in black bloc. And you want to talk about recruitment. I saw an older anarchist guy with like white hair, and he was this big guy, and he had the bird of chaos. It's a Russian bird. Can't remember what it's called, but it comes from a Maxim Gorky poem, and it's a anarchist symbol, and he had this tattooed on his clavicle, and he was walking around with kids that were like half his size that were in black bloc. And one point they chased a Chinese guy who was shooting video of them, and they chased him, and the guy who's the older mentor was just kind of walking around. And I have pictures of this guy, and I saw him later in Sacramento. And then there was an old school Sharp guy. He had, Sharp, what is Sharps again? The skinheads.
Yeah, that's against racial prejudice or whatever they call themselves.
Yeah. So old school guy with a Sharps jacket, so these are old school 80s anti-racist action people who were kind of ushering in the black bloc, and I saw them very active in San Francisco in October, just before the election. But I brought this all up, to Southern Poverty Law Center. Hey, there's, I consider it to be kind of hate-based when you're definitely hate-based when you're jumping somebody and beating them up because of different political belief. I could believe, And the lecture that I was given by a guy named Michael Edison Hayden of the Southern Poverty Law Center, who then proceeds to lecture me that my question is offensive. And then he starts listing, Dylan Roof, the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, the El Paso shooter. And the method is look, this is what the political right is. But if you sit down and think about it, and when I list political violence on publicreport.org, I don't include in my study, or I include it as a bullet point. But if someone like Dylan Roof shoots up a congregation, there's an element of mental illness. There's an element of racial hate, but there's also a indiscriminate nature of that kind of killing, where these leftist organizations are assuming that every target is somebody on the left, when that's not true. That person that walks in that synagogue is killing conservatives as well as liberals. This is not a political action that's condoned in any way, shape, or form by people on the opposite political spectrum. So it's a complete fallacy, and they won't let themselves be audited or argued with. They'll just block you if you bring this up. And you say, the victims in these mass shootings it's not beneficial to one political party. No political party endorses it. No political party is free from being a victim in those cases.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, yeah, no, it's really kind of it's like a hand wavium squidding type of argument. Like it's sort of the thing of saying, like, well, attacking Paul Pelosi is justified because Antifa in Portland. It's like, wait, what? They're not even anything alike. I mean, and this is the sort of thing of like it's okay to go out and attack mainstream Republicans because some guy shot up a synagogue. That's the same type of non sequitur. I mean,
it is a non sequitur.
Yeah. It's a complete like hand waving sort of. It's a sort of equivocation that's more telling about the person who's making it than the actual argument. He's basically saying
completely passing the buck.
Yeah, I mean, it's every there's a spectrum of people on the right and the left, and like should I mean, because the guy tried to shoot Kavanaugh, or the guy who took a hammer to Paul Pelosi, that doesn't I'm not going to go out there and punch a grandma who's maybe like a wine mom center left lib. That doesn't like, oh, it's okay to do this because the guy tried to shoot Kavanaugh, so I'm going to go out there and like beat up some lady who's like canvassing for Katie Hobbs. That doesn't make any sense at all. But I mean, that's the same sort of argument he's making of like, this weird type of group guilt argument that he's making. No, it's funny, that guy like once called me a fascist on Twitter because I was wearing like a Night Force Optics hat, which is it. Apparently, it says it's NF, like Night Force Optics, and he was saying that was like a fascist symbol, which is like there's some other group called like National Front or something, and it's kind of ironic you brought him up because like that was my first run in with that guy. He was like, calling me a fascist that had like this corporate logo hat on. So, but it's one of those things. These guys are like oriented towards false positives where they just kind of assume everyone's bad.
We need a society where Southern Poverty Law Center is actually doing actual hate watch against both the right and the left, and not just positioning themselves against far right extremism, which yes, there is useful, it's useful to call that out. It's important, but you also have to see how these two extremes play off of each other. And if the catalyzing action is a whole generation that won't allow people to have free speech or hold space without being punched or beaten up, then the goalpost keeps shifting, because they might say, oh, well, no, it's fine, it's just Nazis. But then it's not anymore. And everybody gets labeled a fascist. And pretty soon you have people getting beaten up in the streets. And that's what we may be dealing with another wave of. And what disturbed me and what I found out was Michael Edison Hayden was then talking with Robert Evans, who's this guy up in the Pacific Northwest, anarchist type, journalist, heavy influence, and then Chad Loder in Southern California. And they were all just kind of snickering about me. All three of them had me blocked and were just, kind of, and it was like, these guys really do kind of see eye to eye in what they're doing. And you can't have the Southern Poverty Law Center. I just saw Michael Edison Hayden retweeted a picture of him with laser eyes, which was an Antifa group's tweet about him. So what is the laser eyes? That means you're some kind of based, activated.
Yeah, being someone's like based, I guess, basically.
Yeah.
Or like someone's like aggressive, it's like kind of
an activated.
activated sort of person.
Yeah, so the Antifa
Yeah.
groups are tweeting pictures of him, and then he's retweeting the Antifa groups tweeting. Well, you can't have that. If you're the Southern Poverty Law Center, that completely compromises you. You're in no way available anymore as a neutral source if you're playing an Antifa role. Because what Antifa is doing, especially in regards to like the Proud Boys, there's a group that's on the ground all of the time, most of the time working as security in these situations. And all of a sudden we're supposed to believe you when you're taking up an anti-fascist, the same thing with Andy Campbell, who's this author of a Proud Boys book. He's retweeting, what's her name? Alyssa Azar's endorsement of the book. And Alyssa's like the big anti-fascist, quote unquote journalist, but active in the field, face of Antifa for the most part up in the Pacific Northwest. So it's like, or one of them, you have Miguel, who is up in, when I covered, what was it, Olympia, Washington. You have different ones, but this guy Luis gets kind of excommunicated because he's having an affair with, this is Luis, what's his name? Luis the leftist.
Lewis.
What's his name? I can't remember. But,
I can't. I'm drawing a blank on this.
But they
last
come
name
down
too.
on him last year because he's having an affair with somebody who's not sufficiently leftist and is perceived as being. I think she considers herself centrist, but to them, it's a right-wing extremist. And so he's basically excommunicated online and asking what he can do to he knows that this is unforgivable. And it is so amazing to see them eat their own. But these people who are at the highest points of power, like I'm researching, somebody else was posting like, I'm going back to 2017 and trying to rewatch, a lot of this stuff. And there's some interesting things going on because there's definitely a cadre of journalists in the extremism game that, Daily Beast, Huffington Post, types that are, and Michael Hayden of the Southern Poverty Law Center, that they're all, I'm not going to, they're, it's a kind of cahoots in the sense that they're aligning themselves with anti-fascist activists. And so then their content becomes compromised because they're not really doing journalism. They've sullied the title of journalism because that's not what they're doing.
Yeah, no, it's these folks, a lot of them are, again, it's one of these things where they have a, very much a very distinct point of view, and they're trying to, again, so much of this, it's Jacques Ellul said that, the thing about propaganda is it's not about making up new facts. It's about interpretation of those facts. Like, you can give people the same facts and they're all going to come up with different stories. Like, everyone's had that experience where people have the same information and they have multiple different interpretations of it. People are really, for lots of reasons, people are inclined to engage in a form of motivated reasoning for any topic. But these folks, it's like so many of these people, they come from a certain social milieu in the sense of these urban type of educated journalists. And if you're a journalist, it's very hard to not be a leftist. You have to fight constantly to not, like, if you do that, if you want to do the Taylor Lorenz career arc, it's like basically like hitting easy mode. Just jump in here and write stuff for the urban crowd, that urban liberal crowd that really dumps all over the rural conservative types. but yeah, if it, someone who has like a little bit of integrity is going to have to fight a little bit.
And
Stormy
this is
Petrel.
the
Interesting.
Stormy Petrel. That's it. It's the bird of chaos that I saw
Okay.
tattooed on this guy's.
Interesting. Yeah.
But yeah.
It's funny. It's like with Michael Edison and Hayden. There was a lot of drama like with the shooter in like New York. He had like a Stalingrad on his paper, and people were asking him like, isn't that like the Azov symbol in Ukraine? And he was like flipping out. He was so angry about that. It was funny. I don't know if you caught that, but
Who had it? Which shooter was this?
the shooter in like New York had like a his manifesto with like
Gosh, which
um
shooter is this? You had the
God,
Buffalo one.
the Buffalo one, yeah, the one in New York. He had like a
Right.
Sonnenrad, which is the sun wheel thing, like on his like manifesto. And like people were asking, like, because that's like the Azov. Like if you look at like a lot of Ukrainian photos, they have like it's apparently in Eastern Europe, it's a really common symbol.
Oh,
Um,
so he didn't
yeah,
like that the
he got
Ukrainians were being identified with.
yeah. They're like,
It,
well, he's like, this is a white supremacist symbol, and people were like popping in his mentions, like, well, what does this mean, like with Azov and all these other people? And he's like, shut the f up. He was like flipping out on people, and this is just a distraction, and like it was just kind of funny because like I have friends in Ukraine, and I went over there I was there like a week and a half after the war started, bringing a lot of aid over there to help people, and Ukrainians are really great people overall. It's Eastern Europe, so there's lots of just very like controversial people. Like Russians have that sort of stuff as well. It's not, it's complicated. Eastern Europe is not as tame as like what the Western Europe or America, but anyway, no, it was funny because people started trolling him, and he was just getting super mad about the whole thing because, they were like bringing up his past statements and stuff, and he's like, it was just really
I
kind of
would
interesting.
I would
Yeah.
love to have a conversation with him. Like, I'm not invited anymore to the Southern Poverty Law Center, even though I will hold my research to his any day when it comes to the mainstream political. Like, look, I'm sure they know stuff about what are those groups like Robert Rundo and the
Yeah, the Patriot Front people.
Patriot Front. Those are the
Yeah.
ethno nationalists, and then you have Rundo, who's like what is it, the base or the I can't remember.
Oh
But
no,
yeah,
Rundo's the base. I'm sorry, I was thinking of the other guy for Patriot Front. Yeah, Rundo's the
yeah,
base. Yeah.
yeah. So I'm sure they know stuff I don't know about, like the deep ethno-nationalist fringe stuff. But when it comes to the mainstream political stuff that I've followed, they are very happy just being naively entrenched in what is they perceive to be
Yeah.
anti-fascist, well, an anti-fascist position, which isn't very anti-fascist at all from what we've seen.
Yeah,
You
it's
know?
it's one of those things where they're definitely providing a narrative cover for these people, making it and this is something you see where a lot of these leftist groups are like a paramilitary force. Their point is, and they will tell you to your face, like their entire point is to suppress political activity from Nazis, which is basically anyone who's further right than like Noam Chomsky or something. It's like they're trying to push push the political window in a certain direction. And you see this too, like this is why it happens so much in these leftist areas is like, hey, you've got like a governor who's a lefty and a police chief who's a lefty and mayors and everything that are lefties, and so they're in a position where they're going to there's always enough slack in policies and procedures for any type of government to where they can give people more of a pass than they would otherwise. And it's you see this in Berkeley, like there was a bunch of people who were attacked um, in a lot of the 2017 2018 rallies. Like these five guys beat up one dude at a Berkeley Trump rally in like April of 2017. They literally beat this guy up in front of like a half a dozen cops, like 4 or 5 firefighters. We're all like standing there like 30 feet away, and they ran over there and like literally like pulled these guys off of this dude, and they handcuffed these dudes and like charged them. And they were found like not guilty within like 15 minutes of trial. Like the courtroom, like it's pretty disturbing to read, like the reports of the courtroom, because the courtroom was packed with a bunch of Berkeley people, and they were like hooting and hollering and shouting down the judge, and the judge is like yelling at them and banging the gavel, and like the judge never cleared the courtroom, like they're just being yelled at and shouted down the whole time. And like, yeah, it's like, you can get away with that stuff when the local citizens will just give you a pass for beating up the outside group.
Oh,
So yeah,
here we go. It was Ram. That was the group
Ram.
that Rundo was. And I know, what's interesting is I watched that movie, or no, it was maybe it was PBS and ProPublica. They did a whole thing on Ram and the ethno-nationalists in Charlottesville. Like it was called, what was it called? Like Charlottesville something of hate. And then, but then they contacted me at one point, and I kind of blew ProPublica off because they were trying to make January 6th into like the same series of Days of Hate or whatever it's called. Let me look at what they called it. ProPublica, but Documenting Hate was the name of their like. So they were trying to make January 6th documenting hate, and I was like, I can't participate with you because that's not what I saw at January 6th. I didn't see a hate movement, and that was one of my questions at Southern Poverty Law Center. Is I said what, and I pressed them. I said, what did you see? As far as, because they, in their first draft, and I think they might have changed it since, they said that it was January 6th was an act to preserve white supremacy. and I was like, how are you going to back that up? Such a broad claim, because those of us who were there, you could cherry pick stuff and you could find stuff. There were tens of thousands of people, almost 100,000 people by the Secret Service estimates. But those of us who were there know what the feeling was, and it was this: the people were definitely MAGA Trump true believers. Anyone who tries to come at me with Antifa or anything else is, that's just not what it was. It was spread over several football fields, and that people don't understand the geography of January the 6th in the sense that you had football field after football field that was packed like a Coachella concert, and you're at the Polo Grounds or whatever, and you're like packed in like this. And so all that stuff that's happening, the insurrection, I think, is appropriate for what's happening way up at the front. But the whole thing isn't an insurrection. It's all these different things. It's an insurrection maybe at the tip, and then you have, a riot, and then you have tens of thousands of people who are protesting. And so to really talk about January 6th, I feel like that you have to hear more from people who were there and who are but the problem is that people who were there aren't willing to talk about it, and are certainly siloed or even given a kind of stigma. I've had people come after me just for being a reporter that was there and at me at the FBI and all this kind of stuff. But it was an important historical day, and the way that it was quickly politicized and weaponized, shields the public from the greater story about why people are there. I heard people that were, yes, very upset about the election. And it wasn't necessarily that, they believed in the ballot mules and or Dominion voting. It wasn't necessarily that. Sometimes some people, I still have conservative friends who tell me it's just a feeling and they can't back it up, or, and then I have some who say the rules changed, the rules changed because of COVID, because of mail-in ballots, because of this. We didn't want the rules to change. So that on its own is probably or that the media, squashed the Hunter Biden story. There are other reasons you could protest an election. You don't have to be down the QAnon rabbit hole to want to do that. That's what I came to understand. And I feel I've taken my job is to try to understand why people are there, why people protest. I don't vote the same as they do, but why are they there? And that's been my task. And the other issue was, of course, big tech. in big tech censorship and media. That's what people were railing against. They weren't railing any kind of racial epithet. That's not what that was.
Yeah.
So the Southern Poverty Law Center comes out with that and says that it's a, I think it's Cassie Miller, I think is her name. She blocked me too without even a conversation. But and that's the other thing is journalists don't block other journalists like real professional journalists do. Activist journalists do because they're too afraid of having their content challenged. You know, but real journalists don't block other journalists. They engage. And so Michael Hayden is quite a piece of work. He did send me one email where he says, "Hey, reporter to reporter, I'm not sure what you're doing or for which publication you work. It stands to reason that you should go through our press team and ask clear, coherent questions rather than tagging a bunch of people's emails in this manner." Because after they refused to answer, I wrote them a group email and, saying, "Hey, this is what I saw. I was there. And how are you coming up with this assertion that it's white supremacy? I'm challenging you in a mass email. Now you have to talk about it. Now you can't just ignore me." I guess he didn't like that.
Yeah. That's one of those. Well, if you think about it using their own logic, it's January 6th was mostly peaceful. I mean, if you use their own logic, of like 93% of Floyd protests were peaceful. What is it? If we look at how many 100,000 people were there and how many people actually did something, so it was like, January 6th was 98% peaceful. If you look at it from their perspective, their own logic.
And it's important. It's important to evaluate that in terms of what there's stuff. What made January 6th, much like what made Black Lives Matter kind of go off the rails, was a lack of boundaries. And I could go on about that and what how Trump in some ways set the table for it, and likewise, leftist activism set the table for years for the summer of 2020.
Yeah, it's so much of that is it's so much of their logic is so contradictory. I mean, and it's very self-serving. With a lot of this stuff, like you see this with, like I said, it's like, we had the summer of 2020, the riots those are the most destructive riots in American history. I mean, these are like Axios even worked that up, I think, and they had all the property damage and everything. And it's like the most disruptive and mass riots in American history. But it was still like mostly peaceful. And we can't even talk about that because like 93% of them didn't do anything. One of the things too, gosh, what was I was about to say another thing and it slipped my mind. I had a good point to make. What was I going to say? I hate that. I hate when that happens.
It'll come back.
Yeah, it'll come back. I had a good point I was going to bring up and it dropped out. What was it? I was going to build on my January. I was going to jump from that to something else. Anyway, I don't know. What else do you think?
Oh, I was comparing, right off the bat, I was comparing January 6th to the summer of 2020.
Yeah. And, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
You got it?
Yeah, I got it now. I was going to talk about the election stuff. There's so much crazy stuff around that too, around the logic on that. There's lots of really, really wacky conspiracy theories and so much of the things that people were upset about. And it's one of those things where, and that really, people, we had the big tech collusion stuff that you were talking about. I think that's what a lot of people were really upset about was, I mean, there's no supercomputer in the Vatican that's like changing votes. So like, I actually do a lot of election work as a poll worker. Like I actually do like a supervisory level poll worker. I've done this for years now. And like the people that I've worked with while being a poll worker have all been like really amazing people. I've worked with people from across the political spectrum, like, like hardcore Dems, hardcore Republicans. Everyone that I've worked with has been there for the right reasons. I mean, there's enough people out there. I'm sure there's some bad eggs and stuff, but most of these electoral systems, the people that are actually in the system actually doing work, are there for the right reasons, and the system does have a lot of like checks and balances. So I hear a lot of things that just like make me shake my head um, about what they think happened, but that does kind of go to the point of, it's important for not only for elections to be like completely robust and reliable. It's important to do it in such a way that the most people are satisfied, because elections are critical because they're how we determine who gets power in America. So, you know, if people are going to try to cheat, that's something worth cheating for, because political power is like, we know has happened in the past. People will cheat to basically get anything of value. And political power in a country has value. But that doesn't mean that people need to engage in like these really wacky type of conspiracy theories. The thing that I think a lot of people were really upset about, like, yeah, there's lots of stuff with COVID, with like a lot of these unilateral changes where they just completely ignored the laws with no authority. Like, there's lots of attorney generals who just change, secretaries of state who just changed the rules without even asking the legislature, without even going through procedures for that. And there was, and suppressing the stories, of everything that was going on. It's like the media was so nakedly partisan. Um, you know, the Hunter Biden story was something that, watching like the media, the tech companies, the media, and the national security, state or administrative state, all like coalesce together in one big blob and try to shut the story out of the media and out of the public consciousness, was really just kind of alarming. So I
Yeah.
think that's one of the things where people like, if someone says, I don't want to accept the election because of these policy decisions, like those specific reasons, like, I can understand where they were coming from on that point. And I think people have a right to be mad about that. And I can kind of sympathize with that a little bit. So
Yeah, it's funny, the Hunter Biden thing. The way that the
yeah,
media it's so efficient at what it does, because my mom just a couple months ago, when I brought up Hunter Biden thing, she was like, but that was Russian disinformation."
yeah.
They was like, "They got you, mom. They got you."
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah,
uh,
that's
it's
crazy.
it's really wild, because most people are going about their days. We don't have time. People don't have time to investigate every single story, and so you accept things at face value. And I did that for a long time, and I'm fascinated now, looking back what I know now, through going back to 2016 and 2017, and revisiting certain things, and you start to see things differently. And it's going to be an interesting road ahead. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens Tuesday. And,
Yeah,
it's been an interesting conversation. I think a lot of
it
what we talked
has.
about today is going to become very at the forefront of of political discussions in the next 2 years.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how everything works out on Tuesday, because we've had a crazy year, and it's like, the fundamentals on what this election should be and how it should go are pretty clear. I mean, it's a midterm election. Like the president's favorabilities have cratered.
Ah,
He's extremely unpopular. Inflation and fuel and everything that's going on, like the fall of Kabul. Um, Obviously, I think Republicans are going to have a pretty good night, and there's one of those things where, if it's one of those things with the whole January 6th commission stuff, and the abortion issue too, all of those things kind of pushing back the other way. So, and we're kind of in this area where we're still sort of post COVID, where it's like, how are the mail in, like, how are the different voting patterns people have, or is that going to continue? And it's really interesting to try to study this stuff and figure out like how it's going to go. It was always like, it was common wisdom for so long that if you even like, abortion was like the third rail. If it was ever touched, it was like everyone was, elections were basically over for the Republican Party. It's been really fascinating to watch. There was that thermostatic reaction right after Dobbs dropped, where it's like a little bit of a spike in the Democratic polls, and now that's bled off again. Um, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with that and like how it affects stuff, because people are looking at like the special elections and the polls and how these other stuff. So how that all works out is going to be really fascinating. I think one of my predictions after it first dropped was after everything happened, after everything had a chance to kind of gel, my prediction was it's going to be basically a wash, and it may still have a little bit for the Dems, but you had everything else going on too. You had gas prices were dropping right around the time Dobbs dropped. You had they passed a bunch of other bills. They had some stripped down Green New Deal they passed. They had the Inflation Reduction Act thing. So they had a bunch of stuff that kind of brought a lot of their base back home to, kind of got them excited. The things that I'm really going to watch for, and it's been really interesting in the last couple months, it seems like Republicans have actually pivoted faster than Dems have. And this is, I'm just going to touch on this really quick. Like my personal theory here is people have treated abortion as like this binary topic for so long. It's actually like a spectrum issue. And the reason they did that is because it was taken off the board. So it's like a spectrum issue. Like you actually turns out that, Americans think abortion is pretty tragic and it's not something people should celebrate. But at the same time, they don't really like getting the government involved. So you've got this situation where there's a spectrum of policy positions, and the maximalist positions on both sides are extremely unpopular. And this is one of the issues too. It's really interesting because the abortion topic is probably the topic that has the most competent and disciplined conservative activists in far as forms of the pro-life activists. They're also the only ones where they're more competent than the left. And there's been an issue here, and there was a really interesting piece from Ryan Graham in The Intercept. He was writing about a lot of these leftist activist groups have they're basically vapor locked because the identity politics stuff has taken over so much that they're just completely non-functional. So you have that sort of situation where you've seen Republicans kind of pivot from that initial like blowback, and now the Democrats, they're basically trying to they're stuck in a maximalist position. Like you're not really seeing, I don't think I've seen any Democrats say, yeah, let's ban abortion at 15 weeks or let's ban abortion at 12 weeks. They're stuck at this abortion on demand for any type of concern. And that's literally like the most unpopular position of all on abortion. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that works out. Like I felt it was a little bit of a bold call, but I'm feeling a little bit more comfortable about it now. And like, I think it's going to be hard to suss out what breaks where, but I think it's going to be a pretty decent night for the GOP. So we'll find out. I'm really going to be interested to see what the post-mortem is after Tuesday.
Yeah, it will be. I'm sure we're all waiting to see the most anticipated show of the year. So
yeah, Tuesday's going to be like a 16-hour day for me. So
yeah,
I've got 3 different places, 3 different polling centers that I've got to watch over. So I'm going to be running around taking care of stuff. Anyway, well,
excellent. Well,
it's been a great chat, and
great chat,
good
great conversation. Yeah, and thank you to everybody who joined, to Mary Todd, Freya Lee, to Joe, anybody who weighed in. Thank you so much for
checking us
out. I haven't been on the air like this in over a year, so it was nice to have some support and some chat. And we should do this more often.
We definitely should. Yeah. Especially with Musk taking over Twitter, it's going to be fun to stick around and see maybe we can start doing more of that on Twitter, take advantage of what he's doing.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. We'll look into it.
All right.
We got, it'll be a new political season coming through, so
for sure
there'll be lots to talk about. All right.
All right.
Well, thanks for joining us. This has been
Thank
a
you.
special edition of the Unblocked Live podcast. And my guest has been Erin Smith, and people can find you again at Erin Smith SF.
On
Correct?
Twitter, yeah. I
Twitter.
also have the Contextual Insurgent Substack.com. That's where I do a lot of my Contextual Insurgent .substack.com is where I do some of my writing at. So
excellent. Fantastic. Well,
all
thanks
right.
for joining us, everybody, and we will catch you next time.